But it's important to know that as the United States government right now on a daily basis is demanding that Venezuela allow humanitarian aid into the country, the guy in charge of the Venezuela operation at the State Department has used humanitarian aid to sneak weapons into a regime change target before. And there have been no real negative repercussions for Elliott Abrams or anyone else who was in the Reagan administration for doing so. Hell, the liars are back in power.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, and thank you for tuning into the 191st episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And today's episode is a follow-up to the last episode about the ongoing regime change in Venezuela, making this episode essentially part 3 in a series that started last summer. To fully understand the background you're going to need to get the most out of this episode, you simply must listen to Congressional Dish 176, which was called Target Venezuela, and Congressional Dish 190, the last episode called A Coup for Capitalism. Also, there are some familiar names of creepy non-governmental organizations that come up in this hearing I'm going to play for you today, and so I recommend you also add Congressional Dish 186, the National Endowment for Democracy episode, to your list too. And I'll give brief summaries as I go, of course, if you're choosing to ignore this excellent advice. But my entire message to you in those episodes, if I'm trying to convince you of anything, is that the situation in Venezuela is far more complicated than the President Maduro is an evil dictator, the end story that has been pushed upon Americans by their lazy and or complicit so-called journalists in the corporate press. Now, sometimes I recommend listening to previous episodes, but it's not totally necessary. It's totally necessary here. And the reason is I can't promise that you won't get a little lost if you don't at least listen to the last episode. That's required. So please do, because this is fascinating stuff if you're in the know. But as a refresher, here is a way too brief summary of what's been going on. So on January 23rd, less than a month before this recording, the guy who is basically the Speaker of the House in the Venezuelan Congress, Juan Guaido, he stood up on a stage at a protest and said that he is now the president of Venezuela. Now, since 2013, the president of Venezuela has been Nicolas Maduro. He was elected president, elected in an election, 100%, no doubts, it's true, totally legit. That happened in 2013 after President Hugo Chavez died. Nicolas Maduro, however, was re-elected last year in May 2018, but the election was, let's just say, not normal. Because that's all that's clear here. Nothing in the Venezuelan government has been operating normally since the beginning of 2016. They've had a full-blown constitutional crisis raging for 3 years now. But basically, the groups of people who are not in Maduro's political party are saying that Maduro's re-election is not legitimate. The election does appear to have been a mess. Some opposition candidates were prevented from being on the ballot, and the usual election monitors weren't there. There are legitimate concerns about that election's fairness. However, at the same time, the opposition boycotted the election. They were supposed to be some of the monitors too, and they just didn't show up. And the truth is that the opposition has boycotted every single election since the constitutional crisis began. And so in this last election, Maduro won the presidency in a landslide. So since that last episode, and you know what? Yeah, you guys should listen to this too. There was a great episode of Intercepted, which is a podcast hosted by Jeremy Scahill. Jeremy Scahill is the journalist who wrote Blackwater during the W. Bush years, and I have never caught him lying to me. And so he's earned my trust over a decade and a half. Well, Jeremy produced an episode of Intercepted with some fascinating interviews with people from Venezuela. And one of the things that I learned is why one of the most important opposition leaders was left off the ballot. He was under house arrest for leading violent protests. And when I think about that, here in the States, a lot of felons can't even vote. So forget about being on the ballot while sitting in jail. If you're in jail, you can't run for election. And so, like I said, it's all super complicated. And the thing is that you can easily argue both sides of this forever. And that's really the main point that I was trying to get across in the last episode. It is not a black and white, Maduro is an evil dictator and the immediate regime change is warranted because he's a monster situation. We don't have a Hitler situation here. But Americans are being told, not quite in those words, but not far off, that we do have a Maduro is an evil person and must immediately go situation. It's been repeated over and over again. And I was going to play this clip later, but it's such a good illustration of how this is being discussed here in the States. And I know that we have an international audience too, and I'm working on being more mindful of you. And so you probably don't know what's going on day to day here in the middle of the madness. And so here's Representative Mike McCall of Texas at the beginning of the hearing that took place last week. This is how he's summarizing the situation in Venezuela for everyone who's in the room and who's watching on TV.
When Nicolas Maduro was handpicked by Hugo Chavez in 2013, it was clear that he would follow in his socialist dictatorship footsteps. Since that time, Maduro's policies, rampant corruption, and violent crackdowns on peaceful political dissent have turned Venezuela into a failed state. Hyperinflation has skyrocketed, food and medicine are scarce, and according to the United Nations, up to 3 million people have fled the country since 2014. Last week, a fuel tanker and 2 shipping containers were placed on a bridge to block the delivery of desperately needed humanitarian aid as seen on the screen. This act highlights how evil the Maduro regime really is.
And I'm going to highlight that bullshit line by line later on in the episode. But that's what we're being told. All of Venezuela's problems are the fault of the evil Maduro dictator, and he must go in order for them to be fixed. The Trump administration is not calling for an election that Maduro can participate in. After all, the guy did get millions of votes just last year. He should at least be an option if he wants to be. That would be the democratic thing to do. But no, our government wants regime change. Venezuelans are not allowed to choose a future with Maduro at the head of their country. This much is clear. And our government, the United States government, has been clearly orchestrating this regime change. We are not observers. We are the main players, or some of the main players. For example, Vice President Mike Pence talked to Juan Guaido on the phone and put out a public message on Twitter saying Juan Guaido should be president of Venezuela the night before Juan Guaido declared himself president of Venezuela. Vice President Pence said in that video,
"The United States supports the courageous decision by Juan Guaido, the President of your National Assembly, to assert that body's constitutional powers, declare Maduro a usurper, and call for the establishment of a transitional government."
And then that's exactly what Juan Guaido did. Our government right now is the polar opposite of neutral on this. And so, yeah, that was and remains my ultimate conclusion after obsessively researching this for the past few weeks. We are being bullshitted by the Trump administration and the DC-based journalists who live in the same money-soaked bubble, mainly by only being told one side of the story in Venezuela. And the purpose of the spin is to get us to support their efforts to replace the Venezuelan government. I haven't seen anything like this since the start of the Iraq War. This is on that level in my eyes, which is why I've been obsessing over it for a month now. But back to the backstory. So Juan Guaido gets up at the protest and says, "I'm president." Well, how is that even being taken seriously? Well, there is an article in the Venezuelan constitution that says that if there is a vacancy in the presidency, then the leader of the National Assembly, so their equivalent of the Speaker of the House, would be the acting president until the vacancy is filled by another election. Juan Guaido's opposition crowd and our government is saying that because Maduro's election was a fraud, which is a complicated maybe, but they say it was a fraud and therefore his inauguration wasn't real and therefore there is no president, which makes Juan Guaido the president. And so it all depends on what vacancy means, because in reality, Nicolas Maduro is still at the presidential palace and he's still the commander-in-chief with the military standing by him. And at the United Nations, the person representing Venezuela to the world is the Maduro government representative, not Juan Guaido's, at least as of this recording. When it comes to the rest of the world, 143 out of the 193 countries on Earth have not recognized Guaido as the president. That's 74% of the world that is either staying out of it or saying Maduro is still the president. And so this regime change is dividing the world, and we are on the minority side. But there are no signs that the regime changers in our government give a shit or that they're going to turn around on this. The heels are dug in. And the person who has been put in charge of the regime change for the State Department is a man named Elliott Abrams, who was a part of the Reagan administration and the George W. Bush administration. Elliott Abrams is a proven regime changer and liar, and he testified to Congress about his intentions in Venezuela 3 days after I released the last episode. That hearing is what I'm going to highlight for you today. But before we get to that, due to some of the feedback that I've received, I do want to explain where I'm personally at on the topic of Venezuela. And I don't like to interject my personal into the beginning of episodes. I think longtime listeners know that. But I predictably got some pushback on the last episode, and so I want to address it before we move on. Because even if you have no beef with me, you should hear this because there's new information I'm going to share, and I want to clear this up before giving you any new bits of information for your brain banks. So a great summary of the feedback from the last episode is from this email from... And actually, I don't know if he wants me to read his name, so I'm not going to, but he's a fellow podcaster and someone that I know for sure has the best of intentions. This is not a troll. And I think that by responding to his comments, which you'll hear are not ass kissy, but I think by responding to this thoughtful, well-articulated piece of feedback, I think that I will have, in effect, have responded to most of you that I heard from in the last week or so. So here we go. His note says, quote, I'm about 30 minutes into episode 190 about the Venezuela situation. There's incredible information in there that I'd not heard before, and I want to thank you for doing the digging to bring this out. I have two criticisms about this show, however. The first is that I think your personal politics color the way you present the facts. In one case, it's apparent when you give the benefit of the doubt, in one case where you don't. You seem to give Maduro the benefit of the doubt in assuming that his intentions are pure in whatever he says. I'm thinking of the mega election that he proposed. You said that suggesting that, rather than sticking to the usual schedule, was very democratic. But could it be possible that Maduro wanted to get it done sooner rather than later because perhaps he knew the fix was in now and that waiting would make things turn out for the worse for him? Yes, that's conjecture, but by not at least being skeptical about his motives while being skeptical of everybody else's, you are presenting facts in a somewhat biased way, unquote. Okay. So I don't really think it's fair to say, quote, you seem to give Maduro the benefit of the doubt in assuming that his intentions are pure in whatever he says, unquote. And the reason is that I wasn't referring to his intentions when I said... And so now let's fast forward to the 2018 Venezuelan presidential election because that election is at the center of the coup. Because presidential elections are usually held in December, but this particular election was held early. It was held in May 2018 because the opposition kept demanding an election. And so Maduro gave them what they asked for. I didn't say anything about his intentions, but I can see why you may think that because I didn't give the backstory on where I got that from. What I was referring to when I said that the opposition asked for early elections and Maduro gave them what they asked for is that in December of 2017, the Maduro government and the members of the opposition had talks in the Dominican Republic on neutral territory with Mexico, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and representatives from other countries present as mediators. In those talks, a full year before the election was supposed to take place, the opposition had early elections as one of their demands. The guy who was negotiating on behalf of the opposition said, quote, in the coming months, we want to have guaranteed presidential elections that allow us to express ourselves with absolute confidence, unquote. In the coming months. During the official negotiations, this was one of the things the opposition wanted. They changed their minds and boycotted the election later. But the point is, again, the situation is more complicated than we're being told. Now, is it possible that Maduro ended up having the election early because he saw that the opposition was having trouble getting its shit together and picking a candidate everyone could agree on? Sure, I don't know the guy, and I never pretended to be in his head. But an early election is not something that the opposition was always against, and we should know that because it's one of the many details that's being left out of the story of Maduro, the evil dictator. And also notice that the opposition wanted presidential elections only. President Maduro had a different suggestion, and this is what I said about it. In fact, Maduro wanted to have an election for all seats. He wanted to have a so-called mega election, which would be an election to redetermine the presidency, the National Assembly, the governorships, the mayors, all of them, which was reported as a move to consolidate his power, But that doesn't make any sense because Maduro's party had the presidency and most of the governorships and the mayorships. The opposition only had the National Assembly. So a redo-it-all election, that puts it all up for grabs. You know, it's a pretty fucking democratic idea if you ask me. And if our country gave a hot damn about democracy in Venezuela, a mega election sounds like what we should be pushing for, you know, settle it all once and for all. We should want them to elect a new Congress and a new president with everyone allowed on the ballot. But that's not what we're calling for. And when Maduro suggested it, the opposition, who boycotted the 2017 elections, well, they refused to participate in the so-called mega election too. Now, I don't know what Maduro's intentions were with the suggestion of a mega election. If anyone is assigning intentions to actions, it's the people saying that this was definitely a move designed to consolidate his power. A claim I responded to that didn't make sense to me for the reasons that I said. But when it comes to my personal feelings about it, I like the idea of the mega election regardless of the reasons behind why it was presented. The idea of a big election seems fair. Because remember, a vital piece of information that's being left out of this story is that the National Assembly itself was ruled to be illegitimate by the Venezuelan Supreme Court. That's what started the constitutional crisis in early 2016 to begin with. It's a complicated situation. And the fairest way that I can think of solving this is to start from scratch and have an election that wipes away all the questions of legitimacy, everyone's legitimacy. If my country were representing me right now, that's what they would be calling for, with every person who wants to run allowed on the ballots, including President Maduro. He won the last election, fraudulent or not. He should at least be an option. And so when I read that President Maduro was suggesting something quite close to what I think is the most democratic and fair path forward, I thought it was worth mentioning. Because if you think democracy is a governing system worth supporting, which I do, an election is the ideal way to solve this. Not a regime change followed by an election which excludes the current president, which is what we're attempting to do. That is a sneaky ass coup. And by telling you this, I'm not assigning intentions and saying that Maduro is a sweetheart with nothing but good ones. What I am doing is looking at the two sides. One where one is calling for a mega election and in which he'd have a lot to lose, and the other side is boycotting all of the elections. And I'm just telling you who is on which side in that issue debate, because it wasn't what I was expecting. And then as for, quote, I think your personal politics color the way you present the facts, unquote, well, you bet your ass they do. Because I was a dumbass American 20-year-old in the spring of 2003. The most important thing in the world to me at that time was that my boyfriend and I broke up and I was sad. But then I studied abroad in Germany. I lived there for 5 months from January to May 2003. And while I was living there, my country started the Iraq War, and it changed my entire life. In fact, it changed who I am, although I didn't realize it at the time. But right when I first got to Germany, I watched the State of the Union with my German host mother, who I had only met like a couple weeks before. And that night, George W. Bush said,
"The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa."
And that's scary. That night I was physically much closer to Iraq than I was comfortable with. I was far from home. And I knew because it was widely discussed that there is a major U.S. military base in Germany, which sounds like a possible target to me and to most of the people in Germany. And so, yeah, that freaked me out, just like I think it freaked everyone out. But then the speech ended, and then there was a commercial break, and then the local news came on. And the top story, as translated for me by Elka, was that there were reports out of Great Britain that said that what the Bush administration just told us wasn't true. The European media, within minutes of that State of the Union, told me that Saddam Hussein did not seek significant quantities of uranium from Africa. And at the time, I didn't know what to believe, but it was interesting that they were saying that. And I stored that information in my brain bank and went on with my life. Although I do have to admit that I felt better than I had an hour before about my chances of not being incinerated. It made me feel better. Maybe that's why I remembered it. But flash forward to 2006, okay? 3 years later, I'm back in the States. I had graduated college. I was a corporate drone. That ex-boyfriend that I was all sad about was by then a Navy medic, and he was in one of the stages of his 2 tours that he ended up serving in Iraq. And at the time, him and I were still good friends. We will always be good friends. In fact, he was in my wedding. And so having his life in danger for years was terrifying. And he survived, but not all of his friends did. And, I won't say more because it's not my story to tell, but let's just say that I'm of the generation of peasants who's had loved ones fight and die in the Iraq War. But anyway, it's summer 2006, and that's where I'm at life. And there's a scandal in the W. Bush administration. Reporter Joe Wilson had written an article titled "What I Didn't Find in Africa," in which he told us here in the States that he was sent on a fact-finding mission to investigate whether Saddam Hussein was trying to buy uranium from Africa, and the answer was no. And he told that to the W. Bush administration, and that was before I moved to Germany. He said no in 2002, but they put that in the State of the Union anyway. That means that George W. Bush, in that State of the Union, he lied, and the administration lied many times about it after that. But they lied. And I had known the truth for 3 years because I wasn't in this country when the lie took place. It was 3 years before the New York Times published that information. It was 3 years before any Americans on this continent got that information that I had gotten within minutes of the State of the Union. For 3 years, I had just assumed that everyone else had known this too. And I'll never forget that feeling of betrayal. Having this undeniable proof that we weren't being told the entire story here in the United States in the run-up to a war. Ask anyone who regularly travels abroad. The news, it's different outside this US bubble. And as far as the government is concerned, now the same exact humans that were in the unpunished criminal organization known as the George W. Bush administration are back in power. John fucking Bolton, Elliott Abrams. And they're telling us lots of scary things about Venezuela, saying that the dictator president has got to go. I've seen this before, and the media landscape has only gotten more corporate and CIA infected. And so, yeah, I'm biased as I don't trust these people, and I don't trust that we're being told the full story. I said it many times, but unbiased reporting doesn't exist. Everyone is shaped by the experiences that they've had in their lives, and I don't strive to be unbiased because it's impossible. I can't just pretend that those lies never happened or that I don't know about them, and I'd be doing us all a great disservice if I did. And so instead of striving for the impossible standard of unbiased, I strive to be fair. I admit my mistakes when I find them. And I give you all of my sources for every single episode, which adds many hours and a few $100s to the cost of the production of every single episode of Congressional Dish. But I think it's important to earn your trust. And this is how I think it's best to do so, because that's what I want others to do to earn my trust. And so that's what I do for you. But anyway, back to his note. Quote, I understand you liked the Chavez-Maduro practice of nationalizing various industries. Unquote, well, you understand incorrectly because you never asked. I never said I like nationalized industries because I don't give a shit what Venezuela does with their oil. Although actually that's not true. If I was global dictator, would like for Venezuela and every country on earth, including my own, to keep all the fossil fuels in the ground. But that's a topic for a different day. But if the people of Venezuela want to use their oil wealth to pay for services instead of using taxes, fine. Good luck to you. If the Venezuelans want to allow Chevron and Halliburton to take their oil, sell it, and funnel profits to the Cheney families of the world, fine. Go ahead. What I don't approve of, however, is the World Trade System forcing their will upon Venezuela on behalf of Chevron and Halliburton and the other resource-gobbling multinationals. I don't want the desires of multinationals being forced upon any of us, because this affects us peasants in every country. For example, we Americans are allowing multinational corporations to frack the shit out of Texas, Pennsylvania, North Dakota, a lot of communities here in the United States. In fact, we're doing it here in California. We're doing this in earthquake country. And if my American friends and family members in those communities ever chose to prioritize the cleanliness of their air, the stability of their ground, the drinkability of their water, and wanted to shut the fracking down, they should have that right. We should have that right. And when we do, we shouldn't have to pay these companies off with our tax money because the World Trade System says so. A system of economic laws that we had no role in writing or direct votes approving. I'm all for creating a global system because we can all communicate now with fairly written and voted upon rules to work out fair solutions to those types of situations. But the World Trade System, from what I know about it, isn't that. And that's what I'm against. An undemocratic global economic system, the expansion of which is being branded as spreading democracy, but in reality is preventing billions of people from having control over what happens in their own communities. And my country is the one that is leading this. It's my tax money that's paying for the expansion, and it's my friends dying to enforce its expansion. And so, no, I'm not advocating for nationalization. I don't give a single what each country chooses to nationalize and what they don't. I care that it's their choice. And the pattern of our involvement in regime changes that lead to privatizations is impossible to ignore. I'm fascinated by the consistency of that pattern that I wasn't aware of, 5 years ago, 3 years ago? This is new to me, and that's why I keep pointing it out. Back to the note. He said, quote, "And it sounds to my ears that because you like that policy, you're willing to give Maduro the benefit of the doubt." Well, it is this agreement that also colored the way you talk about Venezuela seizing Canadian gold mines. You claim that the world economic groups didn't like anything that would eat into profits. Perhaps that's true, but another way to put it would be that anyone, the world economic groups included, wouldn't like stealing. Stealing is wrong even if you're stealing from multinational corporations, right? But instead, you come at this appropriation from your preferred political point of view. You won't give them the benefit of the doubt because of personal politics, unquote. Well, that sounds to me like you don't like the way I put it. You would prefer that I call it stealing when a country takes back resources from a multinational corporation. But the thing is, I'm not going to put things the way you want me to sometimes because I don't agree with you. I don't think that communities taking control of their resources in their own neighborhoods is stealing. I don't think a company based in Canada has more of a right to Venezuelan gold than the people who live in Venezuela. Some of these multinational contracts last for 50, 70, 99 years. I don't think long contracts like that should ever be allowed. Why should a community be held to a contract that was signed 3 generations ago? And I fully support fair settlements with companies so that they don't lose money when communities take their resources back. But the company shouldn't be guaranteed profits. If a Canadian company chooses to contract halfway around the world for resources in a foreign community, there are and should be risks involved. And companies should sometimes lose when they take those risks. These companies should be given the incentive to be such good neighbors, so beloved that people want them there, or bye-bye. And so no, I won't characterize taking back community resources from multinational corporations as stealing. If a community is getting enough benefit from the corporate partnership that they want it to continue, great. If the community is not happy with the results of the partnership, well, the community should have the right to determine what happens literally in their backyards. Market forces. But that's not what's going on. The fact that a court system with no juries exists to guarantee corporations' rights and expected profits all over the world is a sign of a rigged in favor of corporations system. That's how I put it. If you think it's stealing, say you think it's stealing. But don't get pissed at me for not saying what you want to hear. This isn't that kind of show. I'm not preaching to any choir. Back to the note, he said, quote, "Your shows are jam-packed with so much behind-the-scenes information, and you often go after both sides. But whenever I come across these examples of personal bias coloring the presentation of that information, it really sticks out. I don't mind hearing your personal politics, even if I disagree with much of it, especially economically. My criticism is when you start assigning motivations to people or groups based on political stereotypes," unquote. And all I want to say in response to that is I think maybe you're assigning some incorrect political stereotypes to me. The last part of his note said, quote, "Though I have to say it again, it's so good to hear you explaining all this to a bunch of laymen like me. Thanks for all you do," unquote. Well, thank you, my friend, for writing and for keeping this disagreement civil. I do appreciate you. But that was pretty much the gist of all the feedback that I got, just wrapped up in this one perfect email. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from, guys. And it's up to you whether or not you trust me. I mean, I don't know what else to do. Okay, so now that that's all cleared up and you know exactly what my biases are, Team Peasant every day. Let's get started with the hearing. This hearing took place the day before Valentine's Day on February 13th, just a few days after I released the last episode with Elliott Abrams as the star witness. And this hearing did go viral, or I shouldn't say that, at least one part of this hearing did go viral. And that's the interaction that Elliott Abrams had with freshman representative Ilhan Ilhan, I think is how I say her first name, but Representative Omar of Minnesota. And so let's start there. But we need a lot of backstory first, because she brought up events that Abrams was a player in, but most of the events she referred to took place in the 1980s, and I was a baby. When it comes to recent American history, you should know that I feel like my knowledge is pretty solid starting around 9/11. But everything before that is fuzzy at best. And so in the clip you're eventually going to hear, uninterrupted in its entirety, Representative Omar mentions 3 places: Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. And I didn't really know what went on there in the 1980s, and I certainly didn't know the details of Elliott Abrams' role in those places, and so down 3 rabbit holes we go. So first, Guatemala. Guatemala was one of the first countries to get CIA regime changed in the 1950s. In the 1920s, land that was shared by community farmers was sold to multinationals, specifically the United Fruit Company. By the 1930s, the United Fruit Company had been sold 500,000 acres of public land, was exempt from all Guatemalan taxes, and was legally guaranteed that no company would be allowed to compete with it. Also, the United Fruit Company was allowed to treat its local workers like shit. In the early 1940s, the government that gave United Fruit Company those sweetheart deals was overthrown by students and middle-class workers. In the years that followed, elections started determining who would rule Guatemala. By the 1950s, the citizens of Guatemala had chosen to elect Jacobo Arbenz as their president. One of the main policies of Jacobo Arbenz was land reform, as in taking land owned by but unused by United Fruit Company and giving it back to the community so that they could grow their own food and have their own businesses. The wealthy families and companies who had their unused land returned to the communities were paid government bonds in amounts equal to the value of the land that the rich people had claimed on their taxes. But those that underreported their land's value in order to dodge taxes were pissed that they were underpaid, but I guess karma is a bitch. But the effect was that the law gave hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans land to farm and improved all of their living standards. Or at least, I don't know all of them, but in general, it's been reported that this improved their living standards. Makes sense to me. However, due to the amount of land that the United Fruit Company had and the fact that they were squatting on and not using most of it, this change in the law affected the United Fruit Company more than anybody else. And so the United Fruit Company turned to the United States, the government of which, much like today, was dominated by ethically f***ed businessmen. The United Fruit Company paid for a full-blown bullshit campaign within the United States, which portrayed the Guatemalan government as communist. Ooh. You know, I still don't get what all you boomers and your parents were so afraid of. A different economic system. Ooh, the Reds. Ooh. Ugh, so dumb. But Americans at that time had their panties all twisted over communism, and so it was effective. The United Fruit Company also paid for a huge study for Congress trashing the Guatemalan government, much like how the fossil fuel multinationals have been caught over and over again paying for studies downplaying the effects of carbon dioxide and methane on the climate. And this method works. The CIA overthrew the elected Guatemalan government in 1954, a regime change approved by President Eisenhower. At the time, the CIA director was Allen Dulles, who was a lawyer who made deals on behalf of the United Fruit Company during his private sector years. Following the CIA's 1954 coup overthrowing the elected president of Guatemala, at least 200,000 civilians died during 40 years of the military dictatorships that ruled afterwards. Military dictatorships that most of them got financial and military support from the United States. According to the Diary of Regime Changes, a great book called Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA by Tim Weiner, it's estimated that between 90 and 96% of those deaths came at the hands of the Guatemalan military. Flash forward, March 1982, 3 days before I was born, General Rios Montt seized power in Guatemala by overthrowing the previous dictator. General Rios Montt had been trained militarily by the United States, and so for obvious reasons, President Ronald Reagan chose to treat the new dictator as an ally in Reagan's quest to defeat his so-called communist enemies in Central America. The year following the coup and installation of U.S.-trained General Rios Montt, the Reagan administration lifted a prohibition on weapons sales to Guatemala because of what it said were significant steps taken by the Guatemalan government to end human rights abuses. The State Department specifically allowed Guatemala to buy spare parts and other equipment for its Air Force, mostly to rehabilitate American-made helicopters. But it was during the same time that the Reagan administration was certifying Guatemala's human rights improvements and giving them parts of weapons for their good behavior that the government of General Rios Montt was in the process of exterminating 5.5% of the Maya Ixil population, a community of people who grew food, formed labor unions, and aggressively took back land from companies in their communities. It also appears that the unelected president was a whack job religious person waging a, quote, final battle, unquote, against these people that he considered his enemies. And I honestly didn't go in too deep into what was going on in his mind. I really don't know why this group of people were targets, but all I know for sure is that a lot of them were killed. And the way that it was done was that starting in July 1982, the Guatemalan army burned their houses, destroyed their fields, killed their animals, and murdered as many people as they could. Those helicopters that the Reagan administration helped the military to repair were used to bomb the people who ran into the mountains trying to get away. And General Rios Montt was eventually arrested decades later for this and stood trial in Guatemala, specifically charged with 15 massacres, 15 mass killings, in which 1,161 people were killed and 29,000 homes were destroyed, on top of rape and other murder charges. During the only 17 months, he wasn't even in power that long, but during the 17 months that this general ruled Guatemala, we now know that over 81,000 people, most of them Maya Indians, were confirmed killed or were disappeared. That's an average of over 4,700 dead people per month during his unelected presidency in a country the size of Tennessee. That would be impossible not to notice. And so keeping that in mind, the following interview with Elliott Abrams took place in late January 1983. And just to make this clear for sourcing purposes, the YouTube page has this dated as November 30th, 1983, but that date isn't in the video itself. And the events Jim Lehrer describes, and I looked into it, the timeline of all of it lines up with this being aired during the week following the Reagan administration's decision to sell helicopter parts to General Rios Montt in Guatemala. So I'm saying this was aired the week of January 23rd. And so assuming that's correct, this was exactly 10 months after General Rios Montt took over in that coup. He started destroying the Maya Indian communities in July 1982. And so that massacre, basically, or series of massacres, started 6 months before this interview. And again, we know that during his 17 months in office, this guy's military killed approximately 4,700 people per month. And so 10 months into that festival of death is when Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, Elliott Abrams, gave this interview to Jim Lehrer. And you can watch the whole thing using the link to PBS NewsHour's YouTube page that I put in the show notes. But here's the part of their conversation I think you need to hear.
On the killings, in 1981, as I'm sure you're aware, the State Department said there was between 250 to 300 political killings a month in Guatemala. Can you give me any idea as to what that figure is now?
Our latest figures are down to about 40 or 50 a month, which is a considerable reduction. We're not suggesting a situation of 40 or 50 a month is good, but it's a lot better. And we think that kind of progress needs to be rewarded and encouraged.
And you think this sale will, in fact, encourage more, not less? I mean, more progress, not less progress?
Yes, absolutely, because...
Now, why?
Because it shows the government that we mean it when we say that we are behind these kinds of moves and that if you make these kinds of moves, we're willing to support you. If we take the attitude that don't come to us until you're perfect, we're going to walk away from this problem until Guatemala has a perfect human rights record, then we're going to be leaving in the lurch people there who are trying to make progress and are succeeding.
Do you firmly believe that the key person who's trying to make progress is President Rios Montt?
Yes, because the government policies really changed after he came in March of last year. And he is, I think it's fair now to say, practicing what he preaches. There has been a tremendous change, especially in the attitude of the government towards the Indian population, which used to be seen as an enemy and is now seen as a citizen population, as an ally in the struggle for the future of Guatemala.
Ladies and gentlemen, Elliott Abrams. Flash forward many decades later, and in a rare story of justice sort of being served these days, in 2013, General Rios Montt was found guilty of genocide against the Indian population and crimes against humanity. The 86-year-old was sentenced to 80 years in prison. Now, he served only one weekend behind bars before the verdict was overturned and a new trial ordered, but he died under house arrest last year. But a trial did happen, and the genocide was acknowledged by the entire world. The Reagan administration helped arm the military that committed the genocide, and you heard for yourself Elliott Abrams playing Spin Master on TV to cover it up. And so there's one backstory you need to know. And so now let's move one country south to El Salvador. And for those of you who aren't great with maps, no judgment, I had to look it up. But the geography going from north to south goes US, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua. So that's the part of the world that we're talking about here. But El Salvador, out of all those countries, is by far physically the smallest. The entire country is about the size of Massachusetts. And much like in Guatemala in the 1980s, more than 75,000 citizens were killed in El Salvador, most of them victims of the military and its death squads. And yes, the United States funded and armed that military too. On October 15, 1979, El Salvador's government was overthrown by a group of young military officers who were supported by the Carter and Reagan administrations. In El Salvador, there were thousands of people in labor unions and student organizations and other such peasant groups who were using their power of numbers to mobilize large protests capable of shutting down cities. And they were protesting the installed in a coup government. These people were labeled communists, and for 12 years, the United States government funded the military that slaughtered them in a civil war. Reagan gets blamed for most of this, but the funding of the El Salvadorian government fighting the communists, well, that support started in the Carter administration. This was bipartisan. The Carter administration, in dealing with El Salvador, consistently opposed any idea that would have given the people organized as the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or FMLN, any chance of political power. This meant that the United States position required a defeat of the FMLN, rather than a negotiated solution that would have had to have some sort of power-sharing agreement between the FMLN and the military commanders controlling the government. 13 years later, the way the Civil War ended is that a negotiated solution was created that allowed the FMLN to become a political party that is in fact holding the presidency of El Salvador right now, today. In the meantime, in large part due to the insistence of the Carter and Reagan administrations that defeat must be the objective, civil war waged, with our tax money helping to kill over 75,000 people before the peace accords were signed in 1992. During that civil war, the governments supported in El Salvador did not allow public resistance to their policies. Any group or individual who did resist was risking their lives, unlike the situation in Venezuela today, where peaceful protests are allowed to happen all the time. I know there's been violence, but look on Twitter, look on YouTube. There are marches all the time in Venezuela. Juan Guaido pronounced himself president at one of them on January 23rd. But in El Salvador in the 1980s, when our government gave approximately $6 billion in cash and in weapons to the El Salvadorian government, according to a UN report, quote, the main characteristics of this period were that violence became systematic and terror and distrust reigned among the civilian population. The fragmentation of any opposition or dissident movement by means of arbitrary arrests, murders, and selective and indiscriminate disappearances of leaders became common practice. Repression in the cities targeted political organizations, trade unions, and organized sectors of Salvadorian society, unquote. The report also says that political organizations and trade unions were the targets of the military. Those were the scary communists that we paid to kill, the people who were fighting for fair wages. During most of the Civil War years, the government was controlled by a dude named Napoleon Duarte, who was installed, not elected, installed as the country's leader at the end of 1980, and then he was elected. So coup first, election second in 1984. He won the election with money provided by the Reagan administration through the CIA. It was during that gap, the time after the coup that eventually installed Napoleon Duarte as the head of the country, but before his election, paid for by the Reagan administration. Well, it was during that gap that the massacre at El Mozote occurred. On December 10th and 11th, 1981, Salvadorian troops who had just returned from a 3-month military training course in the United States killed between 500 and 1,200 innocent people at El Mozote. First, they tortured and killed all the men. Then they killed the women. And last, they killed the children by spraying machine gun fire into the tiny building where all the children were gathered. And then they burned the building. And this was a civil war and the violence went both ways. Not evenly, We know from the UN report that it was 85% military murders, but there was violence on both sides. But nothing justifies that. Nothing. The stories about that 2-day period are absolutely horrific. A few I'm so haunted by that I don't want to put those images in your head because I don't have to. If you want the gory details, they're in the show notes in the UN report and other sources, newspaper articles. There's all kinds of shit in the show notes on this one. But trust me on this, it was savagery, rapes, murders, horrific. And by the end of 1982, the whole world knew about it. One day before the Reagan administration was required to certify to Congress that the government they were supporting in El Salvador was improving in regards to human rights, which was a condition that needed to be met in order for U.S. aid to the El Salvadorian government to continue, well, the U.S. press reported about the massacre. The Reagan administration knew about the death squads and other acts of violence that our money was funding, but they certified the government's human rights compliance anyway. And for his part, Elliott Abrams, at the time the Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs, testified to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in February 1982. Again, this was before Duarte was legitimized in a 1984 election that the Reagan administration gave him money to help him win. In that hearing, Elliott Abrams told Congress that the real outrage should be that the incident was reported right when the Reagan administration was trying to certify El Salvador's human rights records. So like, ooh, you dirty messenger, how dare you tell people about that massacre right now? And he said, quote, "It appears to be an incident which is at least being significantly misused at the very best by the guerrillas," unquote. And so he dismissed the whole thing in his official role in the State Department as just a non-issue being used as propaganda. The Reagan administration then certified the El Salvadorian government has been improving in human rights, and our tax money funded that government for most of the next decade. And Elliott Abrams was crystal clear in explaining what the money and weapons were for. In November 1985, he told the New York Times, quote, "The purpose of our aid is to permit people who are fighting on our side to use more violence," unquote. And what for? At the end of the Duarte government, what was achieved? Well, in 1992, after peace negotiations finally brought the Civil War to an end, the U.S. involvement shifted towards helping successive National Republican Alliance governments, ARENA governments, the party formed to represent the interests of the economic oligarchy. Well, we helped them win elections and implement market-friendly economic reforms recommended by USAID. With U.S. support in the 1990s, ARENA privatized the public bank, the telecommunications industry, the energy grid, the sugar mills, and the coffee industry, El Salvador's most lucrative industry. It also made the U.S. dollar the El Salvadorian currency and made El Salvador part of CAFTA, the Central American Free Trade Agreement. It made El Salvador officially, internationally legally bound to the World Trade System. And 1 year after the peace negotiations that led to ARENA's control of the government and the privatization bonanza that followed, Elliott Abrams told the Washington Post that, quote, "The administration's record in El Salvador is one of fabulous achievement," unquote. Today, El Salvador just entered a transition period, although it is a democratic one. Last week, the FMLN party that our tax money fought all those years and which has controlled El Salvador for most of the last decade, well, they lost badly in an election to a young millionaire in a presidential election during which only about half the citizens bothered to vote. The president of the elect called Venezuela's President Maduro a dictator and is likely to be an ally of Elliott Abrams and his fellow regime changers in the Trump administration. And there's also a good chance that this guy is going to privatize El Salvador's water. So just putting that out there because that appears to be the next goodie on the menu for the multinationals in El Salvador. And now, for the last piece of history you need to know to fully grasp what is discussed in the upcoming hearing clip, some history in Nicaragua. And what the whole Iran-Contra thing was all about, because the crimes that Elliott Abrams was literally convicted of are related to his role in giving weapons to people trying to overthrow Nicaragua's government in the 1980s. In 1979, the U.S. supported dictatorship run by and for the few richest families in Nicaragua, especially one family, the Somoza family, of which the dictator dude was a part of. Well, in 1979, that family was violently overthrown in a nasty civil war and replaced by members of the Sandinista political party. The Sandinista Party controlled Nicaragua's government during all of the 1980s, from 1979 to 1990. Some of the policies they implemented included taking land back from the Somoza family and elite families like them, and expanding government-provided healthcare and education. And the Reagan administration tried to overthrow the Sandinista government the entire time. And when it comes to Nicaragua, not everyone in the United States government agreed to the regime change efforts, at least not at first. Congress, at some points in the 1980s, told the Reagan administration no in no uncertain terms. Congress actually asserted its power, something that I think a lot of us are hoping to see repeated any day now. But the Reagan administration started their regime change operation in March 1981, when 2 months after taking office, President Reagan authorized the CIA to provide guns and money, quote, to counter foreign-sponsored subversion and terrorism, unquote, in Central America. The White House and the CIA told Congress that the goal was to defend El Salvador, which by then was controlled by Napoleon Duarte and his death squads. And the Reagan administration said that the Sandinistas in Nicaragua were giving guns to the people fighting the military dictatorship that Reagan was cool with in El Salvador. But we know that that wasn't the real reason. The real plan was to train and give weapons to a group of Nicaraguans, the Contras, and use them to overthrow the government of Nicaragua. The secret war then began on March 15, 1982, when the CIA, using Nicaraguan agents, blew up the bridges that connected Nicaragua and Honduras. Reagan's ambassador to Nicaragua was not informed that this would take place. In fact, he said that the CIA had a planning process of their own. And later it was discovered that the CIA was also dropping mines, which are bombs, into the harbor in Nicaragua. And if one of those bombs accidentally took out a Soviet ship, that could have easily launched World War III. And so our branch of government, the Congress, asserted its power. In December 1982, Congress attached a dingleberry called the Boland Amendment to a government funding law that prohibited the CIA, the Defense Department, and other agencies from using any of their money, quote, for the purpose of overthrowing the government of Nicaragua or providing a military exchange between Nicaragua and Honduras, unquote. And Honduras was in there because that's where the Reagan administration was training the Contras to fight their own government in Nicaragua. But because the Boland Dingleberry was attached to a government funding law, Reagan had to sign it or shut down the government. So not all dingleberries are bad. But one huge problem with the dingleberries is that there were big loopholes. First, the CIA was allowed to offer aid to the Contras as long as the purpose of the aid was for something other than overthrowing the government. And then second, the Reagan administration was allowed to use the National Security Council instead of the CIA for secret missions in Nicaragua. And so the regime change efforts continued despite the Boland Amendment. The Reagan administration's next move took place about 6 months later in May 1985, when they enacted a trade embargo, meaning that they prohibited some products from being sold to and bought from Nicaragua. The Reagan administration also took away Nicaragua's airlines' landing rights at U.S. airports and took away the ability for Nicaraguan ships to park at port facilities in the United States. This was economic war. Just like in Venezuela today, economic warfare was used to make it harder for the people in the target country to buy things that they need. This serves two purposes: to make the government look bad and to make the citizens angry with the target government for not fixing their problems. And so remember this when you hear about product shortages in Venezuela. But anyway, a month after the Reagan administration launched their economic war on the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, on June 14, 1985, Hezbollah, a terrorist group based in Lebanon, hijacked TWA Flight 847. The hijackers demanded the release of 17 jailed terrorists held in Kuwait and the release of 766 Lebanese prisoners held in Israel. And to simplify this, because that's a whole story on its own, Hezbollah, the hostage takers, were cool with Iran, and because Iran and Hezbollah were cool, the Reagan administration secretly enacted a plan to illegally sell Iran weapons so that they could get Hezbollah to return the American hostages. And so officially, August 3rd, 1985, Reagan gave the CIA director permission to cut a secret deal with the Iranians and the terrorists. We do negotiate with terrorists. On September 15th, 1985, so about a month later, hours after the second shipment of weapons were delivered to the Iranians, the first American hostage was freed. And then 3 weeks after that, the Iranian middleman said that all 6 remaining hostages could be freed in exchange for thousands of additional weapons, requiring far more weapons per life than the original deal. And those weapons were sent, and more money was paid for those weapons. And all of this was happening in secret. The Nicaraguan regime change, however, was not secret at all. In fact, the new Congress decided to fund some of the Reagan administration's meddling in Nicaragua's affairs. Congress specifically provided about $26 million that would provide non-military aid for the insurgents fighting the Nicaraguan government, but the CIA and the Defense Department were not allowed to be involved. Apart from that exclusion, though, the decision on how to distribute the aid would be left to President Reagan. But a month later, the Reagan administration finally openly admitted that officials on the National Security Council were helping the Contras with the purpose of overthrowing the Nicaraguan government, which the Boland Amendment specifically prohibited the Reagan administration from doing. No regime change effort was allowed. That was clear. And so with the regime change effort confirmed, Congress closed the loopholes. In December 1985, Congress dingleberried a second Boland Amendment into law, prohibiting any aid at all to the Contras for any reason. No more humanitarian aid. And all government agencies were prohibited from giving military support to the Contras. In addition to that, the Reagan administration was also prohibited from using third-party or private money to fund the Contras. No exceptions. And that makes me feel a little bit better to know that at one point in my lifetime, yes, I was 3, but at one point in my lifetime, Congress did have some balls and resisted a regime change. So it makes me hopeful that maybe it can happen again. Maybe, if we demand it. Are we going to demand it? Ever? Maybe? But it's possible, guys, it's possible. But anyway, at this point, all aid to the Contras was now illegal. But the following month, $850,000 from the first sale of weapons to Iran was secretly transferred to the Contras. So in public, the Reagan administration was very clearly not allowed to give anything to the Contras. And they broke that law right away by transferring money from secret weapons sales to the people that they weren't allowed to transfer any money to. And this continued for most of that year. And people had a lot of questions, like how are the Contras getting so much money now that the $26 million or so that Congress had allowed to be spent for aid was gone? It ran out, and yet the Contras were still getting more money, more weapons. Where is it coming from? If the Reagan administration wasn't allowed to give the money, what the hell? And reporters were all over it. And Americans were finally told about the millions that the CIA was illegally giving to the Contras in April 1986. And I know the idea of our government breaking the law and giving weapons to God only knows who is just routine for us millennials. But there was a time in my lifetime where giving weapons to randoms to fight governments was a scandal, and an international one at that. In June 1986, a few months after the story broke, the International Court of Justice ruled that the Reagan administration had broken international law and violated Nicaraguan sovereignty by aiding the Contras. The court ruled against the United States on 15 counts. But the court, a part of the United Nations system, has no enforcement powers. It depends on voluntary compliance with its rulings by nations coming before it. And this is just one example of many of the Americans treating the United Nations like it doesn't matter. Look at what's happening now. The Security Council didn't approve our Venezuela regime change, and the Trump administration doesn't give a fuck. Well, the Reagan administration didn't give a fuck about being ruled against by the world either. The following month, Elliott Abrams comes into the picture, or at least his personal crime began. He was in the picture the whole time. But at the time, a high-ranking official at the U.S. State Department, Elliott Abrams personally asked the Sultan of Brunei for $10 million to fund the Contras. The account number used by Elliott Abrams for the transfer of the $10 million was the same account that was used to deposit the proceeds from arms sales to Iran. But apparently, Abrams somehow fucked up the transfer and gave the Sultan the wrong account number. And so some lucky person may have just ended up with a surprise $10 million. But all we know for sure is that the money disappeared. But the point is that Elliott Abrams personally asked a foreign government to fund the Contras in July of 1986. And Elliott Abrams was convicted in court just a few months later for lying to Congress about this. In court, Elliott Abrams admitted that he had illegally lied to 2 congressional committees in the fall of 1986 about his role in soliciting the $10 million contribution for the Contras from the Sultan of Brunei. First, Abrams denied that he even did this. Abrams testified that reports of other governments providing money to the Contras were, quote, false, unquote. But Abrams had done it himself, and so there's one blatant lie. And then Elliott Abrams also knew that the $10 million he personally asked the foreign government for, if it went into the right account, it was likely going to go to the Contras. And he knew that, but he said he knew nothing about it. So that was another lie. But Elliott Abrams admitted that the reason that he lied to Congress is that if they knew the truth, it might have made it harder for President Reagan to get $100 million that he wanted in aid for the Contras approved by Congress. And eventually that $100 million was approved. So the lies were effective, I guess. When it comes to Iran-Contra, Elliott Abrams was all over the Contra side of that scandal, the secret regime change side of that scandal. But I don't think it's ever been proven that Abrams knew that some of the money was coming from secret weapon sales to Iran. It was President Reagan that did the lying about Iran getting the secret illegal weapons.
In spite of the wildly speculative and false stories about arms for hostages and alleged ransom payments, we did not trade weapons or anything else for hostages.
Liars! And another liar on the Iran side of the scandal was then Vice President Bush, Puppy Bush. He kept a diary in which he said, quote, "I'm one of the few people that know fully the details. This is one operation that had been held very, very tight, and I hope it will not leak," unquote. Whoopsie! But in the aftermath of the Iran-Contra scandal, because the generations before me were dumb enough to elect him, then President Bush used the power of the presidency to shield himself and his co-conspirators from accountability. One way he did this was in July 1989, when a bill was passed by Congress designed to make it a felony for a president to disobey the orders of Congress. Bush vetoed it. And then a few years later, on Christmas Day 1992, on his way out the door, lame duck President Bush pardoned his Iran-Contra partners, including Elliott Abrams, for their crimes. And that same month that Elliott Abrams was pardoned, that's when the world found out that the Reagan administration used planes contracted by the State Department carrying humanitarian aid to secretly give weapons to the Contras. Elliott Abrams, then the Assistant Secretary of State for Inter-American Affairs, reached by telephone, denied not that it happened, but that the State Department did anything illegal. But it's important to know that as the United States government right now on a daily basis is demanding that Venezuela allow humanitarian aid into the country, the guy in charge of the Venezuela operation at the State Department has used humanitarian aid to sneak weapons into a regime change target before. And there have been no real negative repercussions for Elliott Abrams or anyone else who was in the Reagan administration for doing so. Hell, the liars are back in power. And as for Nicaragua today, the Sandinista president that the Reagan administration tried like hell to throw out of office in the 1980s, get this, he's back. Since 2007, the same Sandinista dude, Daniel Ortega, is once again Nicaragua's president. And John Bolton, Trump's warmongering national security advisor, he thinks he's so damn clever as he repeatedly labels Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua the troika of tyranny.
The troika of tyranny in this hemisphere, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, has finally met its match.
And so, in addition to Venezuela and Cuba, the president of Nicaragua clearly has a target on his back too. And so, with that history now in your brain, here's the clip that went viral from the February 13th hearing in the House Committee on Foreign Relations. This is Representative Imam Omar of Minnesota questioning Elliott Abrams.
Mr. Adams, in 1991, you pleaded guilty to 2 counts of withholding information from Congress regarding your involvement in the Iran-Contra affair, for which you were later pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. I fail to understand why members of this committee or the American people should find any testimony that you give today to be truthful.
If I can respond to that.
It wasn't a question.
That
was not a question. I reserve the right to my time.
It is not right.
That was not a question.
This committee can attack
on February 8th,
who is not permitted to reply.
That was not a question. Thank you for your participation. On February 8th, 1982, you testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee about U.S. policy in El Salvador. In that hearing, you dismissed as communist propaganda report about the massacre of El Mozote, in which more than 800 civilians, including children as young as 2 years old, were brutally murdered by U.S.-trained troops. During that massacre, some of those troops bragged about raping a 12-year-old girl before they killed them. Girls before they killed them. You later said that the U.S. policy in El Salvador was a fabulous achievement? Yes or no, do you still think so?
From the day that President Duarte was elected in a free election to this day, El Salvador has been a democracy. That's a fabulous achievement.
Yes or no, do you think that massacre was a fabulous achievement that happened under our watch?
That is a ridiculous question, and I
yes
will not
or no?
it. No.
I will take that as a yes.
I am not going to respond to that kind of personal attack, which is not a question.
Yes or no, would you support an armed faction within Venezuela that engages in war crimes, crimes against humanity or genocide, if you believe they were serving U.S. interest, as you did in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua?
I am not going to respond to that question. I'm sorry. I don't think this entire line of questioning is meant to be real questions, and so I will not reply.
Whether under your watch, a genocide will take place, and you will look the other way because American interests were being upheld, is a fair question, because the American people want to know that anytime we engage a country, that we think about what our actions could be and how we believe our values are being furthered. That is my question. Will you make sure that human rights are not violated and that we uphold international and human rights?
I suppose there is a question in there, and the answer is that the entire thrust of American policy in Venezuela is to support the Venezuelan people's effort to restore democracy to their country. That's our policy.
I don't think anybody disputes that. The question I had for you is that does the interest of the United States include protecting human rights and include protecting people against genocide?
That is always the position of the United States.
Thank you. I yield back my time.
So that was the clip that everyone was talking about. But there was another one that didn't get all the tweets, but was quite similar. This clip is of third-year Congressman Adriano Espaillat of New York. Probably saying his name wrong, but you know, I do that. But here is Representative Espaillat questioning Elliott Abrams. And in this clip, there is one more country that's name dropped, and this time it's Chile. And the relevant history you need to know, again, is the Reagan years history. And I'm going to summarize this really quick because we've talked about this before, but also a lot of people know what went down in Chile. So to summarize it, during the entire Reagan administration, Chile was ruled by a famous dictator named Augusto Pinochet. And I didn't know much about anything before starting this podcast, but even I knew that name. And Pinochet took power in a coup in 1973 that overthrew the democratically elected government, and it is well-known, established history that the United States, the CIA in particular, supported his government, which changed the economic laws to make them market-oriented. He took out huge loans from the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. He banned unions. He privatized Social Security, healthcare, and education. And he privatized hundreds of government-owned businesses, allowing wages for the workers to be slashed. He was the multinational's dream partner. And he was also a mass torturer and murderer of people who politically opposed his government and his corporate-friendly economic reforms. And so that's what went on in Chile while Abrams was in the Reagan administration. And so now here's the clip from last week's hearing.
But Mr. Abrams, many of our allies have expressed concern of your appointment to deal with this problem. Some have characterized it as being perhaps like appointing Exxon to lead a discussion on the Green New Deal, or maybe even appointing MBS to lead a discussion on fairness in journalism and accessibility to journalism. Do you feel that your past actions in Iran-Contra have permanently impaired your ability to fairly and transparently deal in the region, since we all know the outcome of what happened then? Do you feel that that's a major problem, baggage that you bring to the table?
I don't, and I've been doing this job for 2 whole weeks. And I can tell you that members of Congress have raised it. No Latin American of any nationality with whom I have dealt has raised it. We've had lots and lots of discussions about how we're going to promote democracy in Venezuela. I guess I should say, since I've been attacked now 3 times in my own defense, if you look at the Reagan record of 8 years, when we came in, there were military dictatorships
Mr. Abrams,
all
that's not an
over
attack. That's a
Latin
fact of
America.
history.
And when we left, in country after country after country, there had been transitions that we supported. Chile is a very good example. So I think it's actually a record of promoting democracy, and I think a lot of Latins know
Respectfully,
that.
I differ with you. I think it's a fact of history. We should not dig our heads in the sand and make believe that this never happened, because it did, and you were at the helm of that. And
I was at the helm of promoting democracy in Latin America.
You may want to
that.
characterize it that way, but I don't. I think you were involved in the Iran contract deal, and I think that permanently damages you to be a fair and impartial arbiter in a conflict that's leading to humanitarian crisis of unprecedented levels in Venezuela.
So there are some members of Congress that are willing to call Elliott Abrams out to his face. And I'm happy they're there, especially as future events in Venezuela unfold. And so now let's get to the rest of the hearing. Because Elliott Abrams was not the only person who testified at the hearing. There were actually 3 witnesses. The other 2 who were invited to testify were Steve Olive. He's the acting assistant administrator at the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean at USAID. And the other witness was Sandra Udkirk. She is the deputy assistant secretary at the Bureau of Energy Resources at the U.S. Department of State. But to get this started, and I already played this clip for you, but Representative Michael McCall of Texas did such a good job of laying down the propaganda during his opening statement that I just want to play it again, but I'm going to clarify some things as we go this time.
When Nicolas Maduro was handpicked by Hugo Chavez in 2013, it was clear that he would follow in his socialist dictatorship footsteps.
Hugo Chavez was the democratically elected president of Venezuela, something that is 100% fact. The elections were monitored and certified, and the entire world agrees on this. So there were no socialist dictatorship footsteps of Hugo Chavez to follow. 1 sentence in, 1 provable lie. Let's continue.
Since that time, Maduro's policies, rampant corruption, and violent crackdowns on peaceful political dissent have turned Venezuela into a failed state.
There's also been a constitutional crisis, sanctions enforced for years, cutting the economy off from money, and a violent opposition that turned protests into riots. Abby Martin, someone I've personally met, went to Venezuela in 2017 and filmed the opposition protest. And I put a link to a few of her Empire Files episodes in the show notes for you. But in the protest one, you can watch for yourself as the anti-government protesters set fires, and they carjacked 2 tanker trucks and used the trucks to block the highway. They then start throwing stuff into an Air Force base. Then the government responds with tear gas, which actually hit Abby and her videographer. But what I saw is opposition protesters baiting the government to react. Everything they did, setting fires, carjacking, blocking highways, and throwing anything at a military anything, would get them arrested here in the States. And the government didn't spray them all with bullets. They used tear gas, just like they do when shit gets real here in Oakland. And I know that's only 1 protest, but to characterize the protesters as peaceful, it's bullshit.
Hyperinflation has skyrocketed. Food and medicine are scarce. And according to the United Nations, up to 3 million people have fled the country since 2014.
I just need to say really quick that I have doubts about the 3 to 4 million people that have fled Venezuela number that keeps getting repeated. First of all, I've never heard a single person provide the source for that number, and so there's that. Usually, when these people have a solid source, it seems like they can't repeat it enough. But also, there's this. This is Steve Olive, the witness from USAID.
When Administrator Green and I were there in July, it was clear that they were saying, and we saw it firsthand, that 90% of the Venezuelans that were coming into Colombia to get support were going back into Venezuela. So they were just coming in to be able to get the vaccines or health care or food or generate some income to be able to go back into the country. And we expect that to continue until when we are allowed to bring in our humanitarian assistance into the country in a safe and efficient manner, in a manner that we can monitor where it goes and that it makes sure that it gets to the people who are in need of it most.
So people are leaving Venezuela in droves, but 90% of the people going into Colombia are going right back into Venezuela after they buy their shit. So are they only being counted on the way out? Who's doing the counting? Are they taking people off the list when they go back to Venezuela? You know, I want answers to that before I'm going to believe that number. And then finishing up with Michael McCall.
Last week, a fuel tanker and 2 shipping containers were placed on a bridge to block the delivery of desperately needed humanitarian aid as seen on the screen. This act highlights how evil the Maduro regime really is.
Okay, let's talk about that bridge. Because the bridge story seems to have been launched by a tweet from regime change co-conspirator and U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. In his tweet, Pompeo has a picture, and I'm sure you've seen it. It's been plastered everywhere. But the picture is of a 7-lane highway with no traffic in either direction. And in the middle of the road, there are big rigs and other blockades stacked horizontally in a line blocking the entire highway. Along with the photo, Pompeo's tweet said, quote, "The Venezuelan people desperately need humanitarian aid. The U.S. and other countries are trying to help, but Venezuela's military, under Maduro's orders, is blocking aid with trucks and shipping containers. The Maduro regime must, in all quotes, let the aid reach the starving people," unquote. Now, first of all, a few planes worth of stuff can't possibly make up for the tens of millions of dollars per day that our sanctions are preventing the government in Venezuela from accessing. And please, never ever forget that Elliott Abrams snuck weapons into a country he was trying to overthrow with humanitarian aid. There is a reason Maduro won't let it in. And with the known history of this, he would be stupid to allow anything offered by the State Department or USAID into his country right now. And this aid is such a disingenuous offer that even the Red Cross is refusing to help the U.S. deliver it. No one trusts our government's motives right now, which really sucks, actually, for the people who need food in Venezuela. Because by all accounts, some people really are having trouble getting food and medicine in Venezuela. But the point is that our government's motives are justifiably suspect. And that bridge, well, it turns out that Maduro's government did put the containers on the bridge, but that didn't stop any food or medicine or anything from getting into the country because that bridge was never open for cars or pedestrians, ever. The bridge was finished in 2016, but Colombia chose to never allow it to open. There are 2 other bridges connecting Colombia and Venezuela, and they're open for anyone but the USAID to use. If Maduro wanted to block people from getting food and medicine in Colombia, those are the bridges he would have to close, and he didn't. So it's just another example of us being served up bullshit, which is then spread around by a lazy corporate press funded by companies like Chevron, which stand to benefit from a new government promising privatization of the resources in Venezuela. But when Michael McCall said that about the bridge, it was after word had spread that the bridge had never opened. I mean, this guy clearly knew.
Mr. Chairman, thank you for inviting me here today, and thank you for the continuing interest and support that this committee has shown, bipartisan interest, in supporting the struggle for freedom in Venezuela.
You are a convicted criminal. You defied Congress. You lied to Congress in the past. You are guilty of perjury and you're lying again. That bridge was closed for years where that food was supposed to come by. And when you were in charge...
The chair will remind all persons in the audience that any manifestations of approval or disapproval of proceedings is in violation.
The facts had gotten out, but McCall said it anyway. And why? Well, because this has nothing to do with facts. Like I said in the last episode, Venezuela is one battle in an ideological war between the profit above all economic system administered by the World Trade Organization and any country that dares to enact economic policies that don't comply with it.
The current crisis highlights the horrifying impact of socialism. Those who continue to preach or show sympathy do not understand its history and the abject suffering it has caused.
It's all about money. It's all about economic systems and our current governments, because we don't have to be this way. But our government for my entire lifetime has not allowed other countries to operate under an economic system that doesn't allow maximum freedom for the private sector to collect profits. Even if democratically elected governments have to be overthrown to get the correct economic system in place, so be it. Here's Elliott Abrams.
And once there is a freely elected government that can deal again with the World Bank and the IMF and a broad international program of support, I think the Russian role will diminish very quickly.
It's already a foregone conclusion that the new freely elected government will deal with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. That can't be guaranteed unless the results are somehow going to be manipulated. Whether that means that the election will be rigged or thugs will be sent out to scare people away from voting. Maybe they'll enact voting restrictions because that sure seems to be working for the Republicans here in the States. Or if the plan is to just shower one candidate with so much money and free information spreading that it unfairly tips the scales all the way to that person's side. But a free election would include the option of a government that doesn't choose this economic system, that doesn't choose to work with the World Bank and IMF. But that doesn't seem to be on the table. You know, when these people use the word democracy, it's used as spin. Here's Representative Tom Malinowski, who's new in Congress, but who was recently in the State Department spreading democracy for the Obama administration. He's talking to Elliott Abrams.
Would you then agree as a general matter, and I know I'm sensitive to the fact you're here representing the administration's Venezuela policies. You can't necessarily speak for everything else, but as a general matter, would you agree that if we are going to be condemning a president who is trying to attain absolute power for life, contrary to constitutions and the democratic process in Venezuela, that we should do so in other countries such as Egypt when that similar situations arise, as a general matter?
I really should not respond beyond the question of Venezuela. It's really not my remit at the department and not while I'm up here. You and I go back a ways, and you know that my view is generally that the United States should be supporting the expansion of democracy all over the world.
Democracy should be global, but that's spin. Because this isn't about ensuring electoral fairness. If it was, Hugo Chavez wouldn't have been branded a dictator because no one thinks his elections were rigged. But Hugo Chavez did use oil money for citizens' health care, education, housing, food. He was good on democracy, but not so much on the economics. And the last administration that Elliott Abrams was a part of, the George W. Bush administration, they tried and failed to overthrow Hugo Chavez. Or actually, yeah, we know they were involved. I think that's fair to say. It's also fair to say that this isn't about democracy, it's about the money. Our foreign policy really does seem to revolve around expanding the world trade system, with sticks or carrots, bribes or bombs, no matter which of the two main political parties we vote for. You know, we taxpayers may want to help people, to stop others just like us from starving or being killed by their governments, or we may want to help them set up fair elections. We peasants seem to really value democracy. And those feelings that we have are being used by the rich and powerful greed monsters in the Republican and Democratic parties who benefit from the endless pursuit of corporate profits. They've hijacked our government by making our electoral process one based on obscene amounts of money. And they've drawn themselves districts that ensure that once in office, it's mathematically almost impossible for them to lose, at least in Congress. These fuckers are not just rigging other countries' governments. We're ground zero. They're doing it here too. And internationally, it's not just Venezuela. Here's Representative McCall again.
Mr. Abrams, I think we really have a historic opportunity to transform what's been a socialist dictatorship that has been a humanitarian crisis into a democracy supported by freedom and the people. And at the same time, I think for the first time in decades, have an influence on Cuba in the Western Hemisphere.
Watch out for Cuba. This is just another warning sign that Cuba's on the list. And this situation, as discussed in the last episode, is also directly connected to Russia, which has been loaning Venezuela's government money, especially since our government cut them off from much of the international banking system in 2017. And check out this exchange between Democrat Representative Brad Sherman of California and Elliott Abrams. It's not just the Republicans who are being reckless with our foreign policy right now.
We've got a situation where Russia expects to be repaid. Mr. Abrams, what steps are we considering to support an action by the Venezuelan people to say, okay, we owe you so much, minus the $2, $3, $10 trillion of harm you did to our country by supporting this criminal Maduro. Therefore, you only owe us $1 trillion instead of $2 trillion. Mr. Abrams, are we discussing with the Russians how we can make it plain to the permanent future Venezuelan government that they do not have to pay Russia and that they will not suffer any demerits in their credit rating for Western agencies and Western banks?
We've begun to have those discussions. Primarily, of course, it would be led by Treasury, but the interim government, the National Assembly, has said that they would repay debts. Some of those debts, I think, were never approved by the National Assembly. Ultimately, it is a decision that they're going to, most of these, that they're going to have to make.
But have we put the Russians on notice that we would support and require our banks to support a decision by the Venezuelan government to offset that by trillions of dollars of claims against Russia, and that we might choose to prohibit our banks from looking at any credit rating that was impaired by failure to repay Russia?
I don't believe that exact message.
I hope you will.
You know, the Democrats really seem to want our relationship with Russia, the only major nuclear power, to be terrible. It's deranged. And let's not forget that the new government in Venezuela that they're trying to install, here is what they're saying about honoring contracts that have been made, like the oil for money contracts made by Russia with the Maduro government. This is Carlos Alfredo Vecchio. This is Juan Guaido's, the self-appointed, not really president of Venezuela's, choice for ambassador in the U.S. This is Carlos Alfredo Vecchio speaking to the Masters of the Universe at the Atlantic Council on January 30th.
Those agreements that has not been recognized by the National Assembly, who has been illegal, we will not recognize illegal agreements. The rest, yes, we will comply with that. And let me send a clear message. For example, the only way that bondholders will not get paid if Maduro remains in power. Nobody will complain with them. And China has to understand that, and Russia has to understand that.
And notice that he mentioned money owed to Russia and China, because China came up in the hearing too. Here's Representative Brad Sherman again speaking to Eyebrows Abrams.
We also have Venezuela reportedly owed China $20 billion. I know that China's policy toward Maduro is different than that of Russia, but what is China doing now to help the legitimate government of Venezuela?
They aren't doing anything to help Mr.
Are they providing any additional funds to Maduro?
No. My information is that they won't lend any more money because they're worried about getting back what they've already lent. And the message that we've passed to them is if you continue to back Maduro and the economy of Venezuela descends further, you will never get paid back.
Clearly, one of the beefs we have with both Russia and China is that they're doing business with Maduro's government. And we know from the last episode, Russia is getting oil infrastructure in these deals and China's getting the actual oil. But the corporate powers want the oil. And here's Sandra Udkirk, the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Energy Resources, so oil, at the State Department testifying to our Congress.
But we do believe that Western involvement in the upstream oil sector will leave us positioned to have both the U.S. private sector and the U.S. government assist with eventual economic recovery. And we are a counterweight to the Russian and the Chinese investment, which is otherwise very prevalent in that industry.
So we don't want to work with China and Russia. We're counterweights. We're on one side, they're on the other. And China has billions of citizens, Why are we doing this? I never want to fight them. And Russia has nukes, War is so scary when the other side can fight back. And God damn it, what are we doing? This is so dangerous. And for what? If I'm right that this economic system division is the true dividing line in the world, that it's not democracy versus authoritarians, but the world trade system versus every other economic system, is that worth all these risks? All this money we spend on weapons and bases and defending this system to any challenges? You know, do we Americans really want to be the goons of the elite? I just don't want to experience World War III, and I feel like we're picking this fight, and I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do. But anyway, let's move on. Here is the State Department's oil lady again.
So one of the reasons why we licensed the continued involvement of U.S. companies in upstream oil production in Venezuela was because the oil and gas sector is the key pillar of the Venezuelan economy, and it will be going forward. And keeping the U.S. corporate presence there, with their best practices, with their adherence to all the sorts of practices that we expect here in the United States, is, we believe, one of the best ways to ensure that in the future, Venezuela is able to return to prosperity and sort of an economy that functions normally.
So the corporations want Venezuela's oil. Got it. But first, they have to get Maduro out of the presidency. And one of the ways, seriously, please listen to the last episode, but as discussed in the last episode, one of the ways the Trump administration is trying to get Maduro out is to starve the Venezuelan government of as much of its oil money as possible. Venezuela uses money earned from selling its oil as taxes. And so basically, starving the government of oil money does mean starving the people. And the goal is to make the citizens so desperate and angry that they demand Maduro leave the presidency in order to make their own lives easier again. And the way the Trump administration is cutting off the oil money, but technically not stealing it, at least not yet, is by blocking the transfer of Citgo's oil money to Venezuela. Citgo is the gas company here in the United States. I mean, we have the Citgo sign right outside of Fenway, and you've probably seen them on the road. And Citgo is partially owned by Venezuela. Venezuela's oil company, PDVSA, sends oil to Citgo. Here in the United States, we buy the fossil fuels, and the money is supposed to be sent back to Venezuela. And the Trump administration is taking advantage of its control of the middleman banks. The best analogy I can come up with is a hot dog transaction at a ball game. So Nick, the hot dog guy, is selling you a hot dog in the stands. You wave at Nick, he sees you, and you mutually agree with your eyes and maybe a, "Hey baby, I want to eat your hot dog" gesture that your mother finds quite crude. But you know, and Nick knows, that you are willing to pay for that tasty hot dog. And so Nick hands the hot dog to the dude in the first seat, who passes the hot dog to you. You pass money to the dude, but instead of dude giving the money to Nick, the hot dog hottie, the dude puts the money in his pocket and tells Nick, "I'm going to hold on to this money until someone better than you takes your job. Now go f*** yourself, kid." Well, we're the dude. Venezuela is giving oil to Citgo, which sells it in the United States. The bankers in the United States are then supposed to transfer the money to Venezuela, but the Trump administration is making the banks hold on to it. And we're saying that it will only be released to Juan Guaido. And so with that in mind, I feel like I learned a lot from this upcoming exchange. In this clip, PDVSA, Venezuela's oil company, is Nick the hot dog guy. And so just keep in mind that that's kind of the setup. But here's Representative Albio Sires of New Jersey talking to oil lady Oudkirk and Eyebrows.
Ms. Oudkirk, can you talk to me a little bit about the oil sanctions? I know that in light of reports that Juan Guaido plans to name a new board of directors for Citgo, the process will require the U.S. to legally recognize the new board members. Would a new board have access to U.S. banks accounts with proceeds from Venezuela's oil sales that are being blacked by the sanctions?
Thank you, Mr. Congressman. So as I noted in my remarks, the key to sanctions relief for PDVSA is the transfer of control of that company away from Maduro and his cronies and to a democratically elected representative of the Venezuelan people. With regards to Citgo operations in the United States are covered by a general license that Treasury issued on the day the sanctions were announced. So Citgo's operations here in the U.S. Are continuing under that license, and that license covers them for 6 months from the date of announcement. The ban is on remitting payments back to PDVSA as long as it is under the illegitimate control. So if you have,
What would a board do named by Guaido? What would that do if he names a new board?
for Citgo,
Yes.
I will have to get back to you on the details of that. I don't have the answer for you right now. I'm sorry.
Mr. Abrams, do you?
Well, we don't want any of the we don't want any funds to go to the regime, so that would not be permitted. But I think there's a lot of lawyers in Washington who are making a lot of money trying to figure out the answer to your.
My daughter's a lawyer. That's not kill the lawyers. Go ahead. Well, you know, my thing is if we are able to get this money in U.S. banks, and obviously under this sanction, could that money be used for humanitarian purposes in Venezuela?
It can. All these funds, all Venezuelan government funds are, in our view, rightly available to the legitimate interim president, Mr. Guaido, and the National Assembly. So they can use those funds to purchase additional humanitarian assistance. Right. There's a lot of procedures to go through to get them actual control of it, and they've made it clear that they want to be extremely careful. They're going to be accused of misusing the funds. So everything's got to be totally transparent. But in principle, yes.
So Elliott Abrams seems to think it's okay to spend the Citgo money. And saying it can be used to buy humanitarian aid and watching how forcefully they're pushing the humanitarian aid, it just sounds like a door being opened that leads to the Citgo money being spent on unapproved Trump administration priorities. You know, I'm haunted by the way that humanitarian aid loophole was used in Nicaragua. Congress says the CIA can provide humanitarian aid as long as it's not for regime change, and Elliott Abrams and his partners in the Reagan administration brazenly used humanitarian aid as cover for weapons transfers that Congress had banned. And now blocked Citgo money, he thinks, can be spent on humanitarian aid. And it's this humanitarian aid thing, this bridge bullshit, the plane, the history, this clip, this humanitarian aid thing, it just stinks to all hell. And I just feel like this is a centerpiece of whatever the hell they're up to. And, you know, that's what's been so frustrating this last month with being immersed in this particular topic, because the bullshit campaign has been so coordinated and overwhelming and so one-sided anti-Maduro and leaving so much out that I just feel so manipulated. And, you know, you may not know this, but it used to be illegal for government propaganda, for the government-funded messages that are meant to convince people of things to be aired in the United States. It used to be illegal for them to do that. That's why for years you couldn't see the Voice of America on TV or on the internet. Voice of America is a State Department thing, and they could tell messages outside of the United States, but not to us. But that all changed in the summer of 2013 after a provision in the 2013 Defense Authorization Act repealed the propaganda ban on the State Department. And now the home of the Global Engagement Center is allowed to bullshit us at home. And you can feel it, you know, they are. And bullshit is key to the regime change strategy. These upcoming clips, just by the way, are the reason that I told you to listen to the National Endowment for Democracy episode, because you're going to recognize some of these names. This is Representative Steve Chabot talking to Elliott Abrams.
What's the state of press freedoms in Venezuela, and how are we countering the regime's propaganda and ensuring that Venezuelans are aware of the support that the U.S. And the international community are providing?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. We are providing support for independent media. We are now up to, with the approval of the congressional notification that is now expired, and we can now use our 2018 funding. We've spent about approximately $40 million or available for one of the areas is independent media. The groups that we are working with, Freedom House, the International Republic Institute, the National Democratic Institute, NDI, and others are working to preserve an independent media within the country.
The International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute. Of course. And a quick reminder, if you're not enjoying a pretty hardcore aha moment right now, the State Department funds the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a private organization created to do the regime change operations that the CIA used to do in secret. This so-called private non-governmental organization is funded almost entirely with our taxes, and it passes a quarter of its funding to the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institutes, which are also private and non-governmental. But in reality, they're basically organizations run by the Republican and Democratic parties, even though they deny it. And so let's start with the one that says it's not a part of the Democratic Party, but has 100% Democratic Party members on its board. And some of those board members include Madeleine Albright and Tom Daschle, Howard Dean, which are all high-ranking Democrats, and these are all on the boards of the National Democratic Institute. And in the Republican one, they have current members of Congress on their board, including the chairman, Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska, who is joined by Senator Tom Cotton, Senator Joni Ernst, Senator Lindsey Graham, hello warmonger, Representative Kay Granger, Senator Mitt Romney, he was only the leader of the Republican Party for a while, and Senator Marco Rubio, one of the people at the center of this regime change. These are the people protecting independent media in Venezuela? Marco Rubio, please. And you know who the chairman of the, okay, sure, it's private International Republican Institute was before Dan Sullivan? It was John.
You know, you're going to have to shut up or I'm going to have you arrested.
McCain. Yeah, these are the people promoting independent muckrakers in Venezuela. Right. But that third one, Freedom House, that name is new to me. And Elliott Abrams listed it with the creepy-ass National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute twice in this hearing. Here's Representative Joaquin Castro of Texas talking to Elliott Abrams.
I also want to ask you, I mentioned the promotion of democracy and the fact that the Venezuelan people have to pick their own leader. What is the administration's strategy for encouraging elections as soon as possible in Venezuela?
Well, that is the heart of, really, of administration policy. That is, after the Maduro regime, a short transition to an election. And that's the view of all of the 51 nations that are supporting Mr. Guaido. I completely agree with the way you started. It's not for us to choose the next president of Venezuela. It's for Venezuelans. We can help, as a lot of other countries can help, in facilitating a free election because there's a lot of experience. The National Democratic Institute, International Republican Institute, Freedom House, and equivalents in a lot of other countries are really quite good at giving assistance.
So those three NGOs together, two of them deeply connected to the Republican and Democratic parties and with histories of regime changes. I mean, they're so shady. But the three of them together, those are what popped into Abrams' brain when he talked about journalism being pushed in Venezuela and election assistance. And here's all I think we need to know about Freedom House for now. It was created to help convince Americans to go to war, specifically World War II, and so it's been pro-war since the beginning, according to its own website. They also say, quote, with Marxist regimes, juntas, and military strongmen holding sway over swathes of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, Freedom House has responded with programs that combine research and analysis, advocacy, and on-the-ground involvement in crisis areas, unquote. And so Venezuela won't be their first rodeo. And the chairman of the board of directors of Freedom House is co-author of the Patriot Act and Secretary of Homeland Security during the George W. Bush years, Michael Chertoff. He's also the owner of the Chertoff Group, which makes shitloads of money helping multinational corporations make money around the world, and his business partner in the Chertoff Group is the former Directorate of Operations at the CIA. In fact, the Chertoff Group is full of spooks, and he's the chairman of Freedom House. So I think I know what we're dealing with here. And so there's another thing with a do-gooder name like Freedom that we really shouldn't trust at all. And so now just a few more clips before we wrap up here. This one is directly connected to the last episode. Here's Representative Castro asking Elliott Abrams about that plane that landed in Venezuela stuffed full of weapons. That plane had originated in Miami, and Castro brought it up.
I have in the past supported sanctions against the Maduro regime because, as Mr. Meeks mentioned, I do believe in many ways that Mr. Maduro has oppressed his people. At the same time, I believe that the role of the United States is to promote democracy, freedom, and human rights around the world. The role of the United States is not to handpick the next leader of Venezuela. And Mr. Abrams, I have a question for you. My question is whether you're aware of any transfers of weapons or defense equipment by the United States government to groups in Venezuela opposed to Nicolas Maduro since you were appointed special representative for Venezuela.
No.
And I want to be respectful of you, but also honest. The reason that I asked that question, there's been a McClatchy News report of such an incident. Are you aware of that news report?
Saw the report, yes.
I asked this question because you have a record of such actions. In Nicaragua, you were involved in the effort to covertly provide lethal aid to the Contras against the will of Congress. You ultimately pled guilty to 2 counts of withholding information from Congress in regard to your testimony during the Iran-Contra scandal. So I ask you the question, can we trust your testimony today?
Well, you can make that decision for yourself, Mr. Castro. I can tell you that the answer to your question is no. It's a simple and unequivocal no. There's been no such transfer of arms.
So there you go. That's what they're saying. And then the last clip of the day, I think, is the one that matters most. This is Representative David Cicilline of Rhode Island speaking to the eyebrows of Venezuelan doom.
I want to turn to my first series of questions because I am concerned by continuing comments from the Trump administration noting that the use of military force is, as the president said, an option. And so for you, Mr. Abrams, my first question is, we have not, of course, Congress of the United States has not declared war on Venezuela, correct?
Correct.
Is there an existing statutory authorization that would allow for a military intervention in Venezuela? Yes or no?
Not to my knowledge.
Has Venezuela attacked the United States, its territories or possessions, or its armed forces?
No.
Has the administration increased troop deployments to countries including Colombia, neighboring Venezuela, at any point in the last month?
Don't believe so.
Are there currently any plans to or discussions about moving additional combat troops to Colombia or any other country that neighbors Venezuela?
Not to my knowledge.
Is anyone at the White House, the National Security Council, Department of Defense, or any other agency making plans for U.S. military engagement in Venezuela?
That's a question I can't answer. I know of no such planning.
Well, consistent with the War Powers Act, I've introduced legislation that expressly prohibits the administration from taking military action in Venezuela without consulting Congress. Will you pledge that the Trump administration will not take any military action regarding Venezuela without consulting with Congress in accordance with the War Powers Act?
I don't know that I can answer that question, Mr. Cicilline. A series of presidents, have taken a jaundiced view, I might say, of the War Powers Act, so I'm really not in a position to speak.
Well, under our Constitution, as you know, only Congress can declare war, and we have neither declared war nor granted the administration the authority to send the armed forces into hostilities in Venezuela. In my view, it would be illegal under U.S. law, inappropriate, and reckless to attempt a military intervention. The United States must show leadership in our own hemisphere, and we must continue to provide aid to suffering Venezuelans. But I want to just build on Mr. Keating's question, because you said of the 51 countries in this coalition, we are the only one that has threatened the use of military force. And in response to a question from Mr. Keating, you said, because we're the only one capable of doing it. Surely you're not suggesting the other 50 countries do not have military capability to engage in a military action if they so elected, do you?
Well, some do and some don't.
So some do, and we're not the only ones that have that ability.
We have not threatened military action in Venezuela.
Mr. Abrams, we're not
all options are on the table.
My question is, we're not the only one that has that capability. So when you said that to Mr. Keating, that was not accurate.
We are the only one with the kind of capability, obviously.
Okay. But others have military capability and have not made the same assertion of that being an option. Isn't that correct?
I am actually not sure of the answer to that, of what other governments have said.
Okay. So, Mr. Abrams, what is particularly concerning to me is that in light of the fact there is no legal authority to express the use of military force as an option, it's unclear to me how the president or anyone in the administration can claim it's an option on the table, because it is not. And to the extent that we are suggesting that it is, we are misleading the international community, we're misleading the people in Venezuela. So I urge you to take back the message to the administration that it is not authorized and not helpful.
And there you have it. That is pretty much the most interesting stuff about that hearing. Moving forward, I'm going to move over to some other subjects, but I promise I'm going to be following the Venezuela story because it's a brazen regime change. How could I resist? But before I wrap this up, there is one last thing that I'd like to do before I end the main portion of this episode, and that is that I'd like to apologize for being a bitch in the last episode at the end of the main show. No one said anything about this to me, but I've been feeling guilty for lashing out, and I lashed out at the Women's Marchers again. And I know my hang up on the Women's March is emotionally extreme, but I'm having trouble getting over it. I'm actually finding that as time goes by, my anchor towards the Women's March as an event is only growing with time. And I don't really know what to do with that. And I think what it is that when I think of what's worked in stopping wars in the recent past, the war that my parents' generation put a stop to, which is something that the boomers deserve credit for, is that they ended the Vietnam War. And I know that big marches, protests with so many people that they overwhelmed the cities and those people in power, those marches worked, or at least they seem to help. So I'm just kind of devastated that I don't think that as I try and figure out what do we do about this, I don't think that method, that marches, can be effective for anything anymore because 3 million people protested Trump's inauguration. And I know, in my head, I know that the intentions of the people at the march were good. I know there was happy girl power vibes felt by people who were super sad that the first woman president is still stuck in the future. And I get that for a lot of you, it was comforting to be in a giant group with people who are just as upset as you were. And I felt that camaraderie at marches too. That's one of the reasons I like going to them. And the Women's March in particular, for a lot of you, it was a girl power thing. And I get that. But I'm a problem solver, and I look at marches as a tool, a peaceful but powerful tool that we can use to get those in power to pay attention to us, to do what we want. And in that light, 3 million people marched on the one day that as President of the United States, Donald Trump could 100% truthfully say that he didn't have enough time to have done anything wrong as president. And so now that 3 million people have proven that they will make the effort to march during the coldest part of the year when Trump couldn't have done anything wrong as president yet, that's the bar. 3 million or less at a march can basically just be dismissed as haters. 3 million, 3 million is the new line. And I don't envision a path to getting more than 3 million people to protest this or anything. These are the hopeless thoughts that I don't know what to do with, and they're making me a little nuts. But for me to be all like, where the fuck are you? Well, where the fuck am I? I'm not organizing anything or even trying to. I don't know what the fuck to do about any of this, but I know that neither do you. And so I'm sorry for lashing out on you as if this is your fault. It was bitchy, and the helplessness, it just makes me bitchy sometimes, and I'm sorry. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do, except for keep doing the show because you seem to be getting something out of it and I get to vent and maybe that will lead to something. I don't know. But as my penance for being a buttface, I shall make this quick because Congressional Dish and I, as its producer, only get paid if you pay us, and it is the honor system here. Your options for supporting this podcast so that I don't say F this and quit are Patreon, PayPal, online bank transfers, checks, money orders, Cash App, Zelle, Venmo, and cryptocurrencies. Please pay whatever you think is fair for the research you didn't have to do and for the boring parts of the C-SPAN hearings that you didn't have to watch. And your support is much appreciated. And now, as a little bonus, here's Representative Greg Pence, Mike Pence's dopey-looking older brother who is now a congressman, with your moment of zen.
Over 40 countries have now recognized Juan Guaido as the interim president of Venezuela.
No one knows more about Guido Toolbags than us.
Yeah, use a headband. Yup. He was like a Guido, bro.
All we need is FPC. Fist pump, push-up, chapstick.
Fist pump, push-up, chapstick! Fist pump, push-up, chapstick! FPC's a way of life. I'm a Guido for life. I'm gonna fist pump till my arm falls off. Fist pump like this, Louie. Yo, you in Guido overload, bro. Oh, my bad. Oh, you mean the eye, Louie. How many times I gotta tell you? Don't fist pump next to my eye. Yeah. Buddy.
And now I would like to thank the people who are making this podcast possible. Oh, but before I do that, I do want to let you guys know that the next episode, the release date is going to be to be determined, because the next episode, I read the HR 1, which is the For the People Act, I think is what they're calling it. But it's the one that I'm actually really excited about, that the House of Representatives put forward. And it does a lot of stuff that helps us vote easier and stops redistricting shenanigans. And I really, really like this bill. And so instead of rolling into PodFest and doing a live show where I'm Debbie Downer again, I'm excited to tell people about a bill that could actually solve a lot of problems. And so that is what I'm going to talk about at PodFest. It's going to be a live episode. And that is going to be on Friday, March 8th. Now, you guys know I usually release these things on Sundays, but I'm going to be traveling. I am going to be at PodFest, which I think my time is better spent, talking to other podcasters and learning and experiencing PodFest if I'm flying across the country to be there on that Saturday instead of holed up in my hotel room doing show notes and all that shit. So, and also, I don't know if the live recording is going to be good enough to release. Luckily, Daryl's going to be there, thank God. So I do have more hope than I did before. But I don't know what's going to happen during that live show. I don't know what I don't know. And so there is a chance that I'm going to have to record that episode just for you after the fact. So I can't realistically have the next episode come out on March 10th. But what I can do is when I get home, bust it out and release it sometime that next week. So that's the plan. It's just going to be, the episode's coming and you're still going to get 2 in March. I just don't know which day. So it'll be there when it's there. And then the other thing I would like to remind you is that we have 16 people who I adore, but who are still sending your paper checks to the Walnut Creek address. And I have not lived there for a year and a half. And so what's happening is I am driving to and from Walnut Creek to get those checks once a month. It takes 3 hours out of my week. And that's 3 hours that I could be, interacting on social media. Who are we kidding? Probably not. Answering my emails. I know I have 150 of them right now. But instead, I spend 3 hours in the car just driving, picking up the mail, driving back. It's such a waste of time and I hate it. So if you guys can switch that address with your bank from the Walnut Creek address to the Florida address, which is listed on any page on congressionaldish.com, that would be much appreciated. But now I'd like to thank the people who are supporting the show. Oh, one more thing, the green room. So this episode wasn't supposed to take me as long to produce as it did. And so I'm still working on the green room. I have high hopes that I'll be able to send that out. But basically what's going to happen is those of you that have contributed since the beginning of last year, because as you guys know, I'm the daughter of all accountants and my sister is an accountant. And so they take care of all my business stuff because I am the black sheep of the family. I'm completely useless. And they didn't really start doing real accounting for the podcast until the beginning of last year, until 2018. So what we've decided to do, because that is really when I had my shit together, everyone that contributed, if we have your email addresses, you will automatically be given access to the green room as soon as it's up and running, and you should check your emails for that. And of course, once I have it up and running, I'll tell you more about it on the following episode because I just don't know how this works yet. So, but it's coming. I'm going to work on it next week. I'm feeling a little bit in over my head right now with the workload I have in front of me with PodFest coming. And I'm not only doing the live show at PodFest, but I'm also going to be talking to other podcasters about the value for value model. So if you're somebody that's going to be at PodFest, I'm going to be doing that on Tuesday. So it's actually before the conference starts, but I will be talking about the value for value model. Plus I'll be doing my live show. I'm just a little overwhelmed. And the stuff that's left to do in the green room is not stuff I can do by myself. So it's complicated, but it's coming soon, guys. It's so close. It's so close. But until then, if you want to hear the golf swing free version of Congressional Dish, just go ahead and sign up on Patreon and then you can switch over after. I don't know, but it's coming. It's coming. I'm signing on for more than I can actually handle on my own. And I do this all the time. It's a bad habit, but it's coming. Okay, so now that I got that out of the way, I would like to thank the people who have either signed up for new subscriptions or gave the podcast a raise. God, I love the raises since last episode. And number one on the list is our good friend, Stephen McMahon, who is now contributing $70 an episode on Patreon. Yay! Thank you, Stephen. And this is a raise. He was contributing via check and Patreon before, but this is a nice raise. So thank you, Stephen. Oh, and by the way, if you guys are contributing on Patreon, like that's the only option that allows me to do a per episode charging. And so that's how that is structured. I signed up for Patreon so that I would have the incentive to produce more than 2 episodes per month, and know that if I were to do that, my costs would be covered for the extra episodes. Because if you think about it, if I do only monthly, if I produce an extra episode, I don't really get anything more out of that, and it could cost me money. So the Patreon, with the number we're at now, we are back to over 1,600. Thanks, Stephen. But we are back to over that. I know that my costs are covered. And so it doesn't cost me anything to produce more episodes, which is why I'm even entertaining the idea of doing more than 2 per month if I can pull it off later on this year. However, if you're someone like Steven that has something like $70 an episode and you were counting on there only being 2, there is a setting in Patreon where you can say, I don't want to be charged for more than X number of episodes. So knowing that starting probably in April or May, I'm hoping to produce at least sometimes more than 2 episodes per month, because there's too much going on and it's too fascinating. I want to do that. That is something that it's a goal. And on my end, this is all so boring, but I'm just using different pieces of software and testing different methods to speed my process up right now. So that's where I'm at. But just know that I'm working towards that. And so if you're on Patreon or signing up for Patreon, if you do want to limit what you provide to Congressional Dish, you do have the ability to do that. I just don't want to give you guys an extra episode and have Patreon people fucking freak out on me because you got charged more. So I just want to tell you guys, like, that is an option if you want to use it. I hope you don't, because like I said, I need my costs covered, but I understand that at $70 an episode, that's a significant hit if you're not expecting that 3rd episode to drop. But thank you so much, Stephen, and please stay warm up there in Montana. He keeps tweeting me about the weather that they have in Montana. Keep in mind, this is February and it's so cold. Like when he talks about the degrees, there's negative symbols in there sometimes. I just can't even imagine. I'm going to Vegas this weekend and I am fucking pissed that right now it is snowing in Las Vegas. And I know that it's cold in Vegas in the winter. I get that, but this is ridiculous. Like I go to Las Vegas and it's got to be so cold, it's snowing. And then I looked at the weather, and the day that I'm going there, and that I'm planning to be outside the most, the high is 48. Like, what? And then 3 days later, the high 66. That I can handle, but a high of 48, it's completely changed my outfit plans. Like, I was going to look cute. It's Vegas. Now I'm going to go in there looking like an Eskimo. I have to. I'm going to freeze my ass off. I'm from California. I can't handle it. So, Stephen just keeps making me appreciate how technically warm it really is here, even though anytime it dips into the 30s here, I don't even leave the house. So it definitely makes me feel like a big baby. But yeah, thank you, Stephen. I appreciate you very much. I also appreciate Sean Fitzsimmons, who is now contributing $50 a month on PayPal. So thank you, Sean. We've had a drop in the PayPal contributions over the last year. And that will help bring it back up. We are also now getting $30 a month from Michael Reif on Zelle, and I love Zelle. This is the one option that has no middleman fees. The money goes from your bank to my bank, and no one has to do any work. So I've been pretty neutral on like whatever's easiest for you is best for us when it comes to contribution methods. That's no longer true. I have to tell you, Zelle's my favorite. So for those of you who care, Zelle's my favorite. Use Zelle if you can. Which Michael did, and this is a raise from $15 a month that he was providing in check forms. So thank you very much, Michael. We are also getting $12 an episode now from Brian Payton on Patreon. Thank you, Brian. Ulysses Atkins gave us a raise. He was contributing $6.12 an episode, and he raised that to $10. And Ulysses is one of my Twitter buddies, so that's why I'm so excited to see your name. Thanks, buddy. We are also getting $10 an episode. This is another raise from Tim Wilson on Patreon. This is a raise from 5 to 10. Thank you, Tim. I love the raises. The raises make me so happy because it's like, oh, I'm doing something right. Raises feel good. Thanks, Tim. We also are getting $10 a month. This is a paper check from John Horner from Bay St. Louis. MS. I don't know what state that is. But he sent in an email and he said, hey, Jen, it's Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, not Missouri. Well, there you have it. These abbreviations, we have too many M states. That's what it is. I know we have an MO, an MS, an MI. I think we have an MN, Minnesota. I think that's you. I don't know, but we have too many M states. I get them confused every time. Clearly, because I must have fucked it up the last time. But John says that the $10 is going to be a recurring monthly check. So thank you, John. And he said, I set it up well furloughed, so don't believe all the sob stories about government employees not being able to make ends meet during the shutdown. Some of us can budget single income with 2 kids and a mortgage right here. John, I'm happy to hear that you were not affected negatively, but as someone who has lived paycheck to paycheck before, not getting the paycheck when I'm expecting it really could have been a problem for me at one point. I mean, I would have had trouble paying my rent. I probably would have eaten some top ramen. All of this was choice, obviously. I'm really thinking of when I lived in Hawaii and I was purposely not making a lot of money because I wanted to screw around most of the time. So it was a choice. But I do believe the sob stories, and I don't think they're necessarily sob stories. So I'm glad that it worked out for you, but I also know that the inability to pay rent on time, and keep in mind, when you don't pay stuff in time, you incur late fees, and some companies don't give a f. So it did cost people money. I do feel for them, and I believe them. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad to hear that you're making it work. That's great. And that you have enough left in your budget for Congressional Dish. That's even more great. But back to his note, he said, I played your Venezuela episode for my wife, and she started ranting about Puerto Rico about half a second before you. She was pleasantly surprised and said, who is this girl? I like her. Send her money. Well, I like your wife. I was already on board the value for value system thanks to the best podcast in the universe. That's called No Agenda. So it didn't take much convincing for me to work you into the budget. Keep it up. Thanks for listening to all the Congress critters and reading their scrawling so I don't have to. You are very welcome, and thank you for participating in the value for value model. I appreciate you very much. We are also now getting $5 an episode from an anonymous friend on Patreon, and our anonymous friend said, hello, thank you very much for all the work you have done and the work I hope you continue to do for the rest of us. I'm a huge fan of the Tinfoil Hat podcast with Sam Tripoli, and I'm glad he had you on because your work needs all the exposure it can get. I think I loved that episode too. I think it's very commendable that you deny the advances of corporate sponsors because truth seekers need a well-researched source of talking points to cut through the never-ending stream of trash being spewed out of traditional media outlets and their new digital propaganda platforms. To all non-paying listeners, if you're willing to pay $100 a month or more for big media subscriptions, which are mostly propaganda and advertisements, you can pony up $5 a month for the golf swing truth. Do yourself a solid and cancel your big media subscriptions altogether if you really want to make a change. Either way, pay for this podcast. Thank you, Anonymous. I should make that the, in fact, I told you guys that I'm going to switch the thank yous around sometime soon, but I'm thinking instead of me telling people why they should pay for the podcast, in that little spiel, I think I'm going to pick one of your messages every time. And if I were to do that for this episode, this is the one I would pick. So telling the community why they should pay, if you want it read to everyone on the main feed, that's a really good way to go about it going forward. So thank you, Anonymous, not only for the $5 an episode, but for that cool message, because that's right. Oh, and this is awesome, Drew. So the Sleep With Me podcast has given this show a raise from $1 episode to $5 an episode. Sleep With Me is hosted by my friend Drew, and his entire podcast, the entire point of it is for it to be so dull that you can listen to it and it'll help you fall asleep. He's got a huge following. So if you guys like podcasts and you like sleeping, I highly suggest checking it out. It's such an original idea. And yeah, it's a cool thing that exists. And he's supporting my show. So thank you, Drew. And Sleep With Me podcast is what it's called. I would also like to thank Keith Andrade. Let's go Andrade on that. He was now contributing $5 an episode on Patreon. Thank you, Keith. Also on Patreon, we got a raise from $3 to $4 an episode from Katie. Thank you, Katie. Oh, Bud Johnson. Bud Johnson is giving us a raise from $5.24 a month to $6 a month. He said he loves our team. Your friend, Bud. Thanks, Bud. We love you too. We are also now getting a $5 a month check from Eliza Blankenship of West Valley City, Utah. Thank you. We are getting a raise, another raise. God, I love you guys. This is from $1 an episode to $2 an episode from Amanda Moe on Patreon. Thank you, Amanda. Krista Polito, who I think is a longtime friend of this podcast, is also now contributing $3 a month. Thank you, Krista. I know I've seen your name before. And Chris Grizzle is now contributing $1 an episode. This is on top of his $10 a month check subscription. Chris is from Toledo, Ohio, and he sent an email that said, "Dear Mrs. Briney," ooh, so official. "Hi, my name is Christopher Grizzle, longtime listener, first-time writer." Really? It's not your first time contributing because I know your name. "You might recall during a thank you session that your husband, I think the first or second time he ever joined you for the thank yous, said I had the coolest name he had ever heard and you agreed." See, I knew your name. I never really cared for my name, for sure, have never heard it complimented before. So I wanted to thank you for that. I'm actually starting to like it now. Oh, for shizzle, my grizzle, you should love your name. Back to the note, he said, "Anywho, I have always been disgusted and yet fascinated with the workings of our Congress and government, and listening to your show has magnified both of those feelings tenfold. But I love it. As far as learning and confirming all the free done in my name as a taxpayer, you're the only source I honestly trust." I mean that. That means a lot to me. Earning your trust means a lot to me. So thank you for saying that. Back to the note, I took a year off, so I'm only on episode 176, so I won't hear this thank you for at least a couple of months until I catch up. But I want to tell you that I love you and I greatly value and appreciate what you do. Like I said, you're the only voice I truly trust. Thank you, Grizz. You go by Grizz and you don't like your name? Dude, come on. You need to embrace your name. It's a great name. I love you too, and thank you for supporting the show. And I hope you enjoy this when you hear this sometime in the summer. We are also now getting $1 an episode from Stacy on Patreon. Thank you, Stacy. And we are also getting $1 an episode on Patreon from Kate Sherrod. So thank you, Kate. Also, since the last episode, we got some one-time contributions. These are lump sums. And we got one on Venmo from Mike Coverdale. And this was $200. And his email, we've actually been going back and forth quite a bit. The email that we put here was, I remember why we chose this one. So he said, "I hope you're well. I was listening to Congressional Dish 137 on the 114th Congress, recorded in October 2016. And in it, you mentioned that fast track authority would expire if not renewed. I can't recall the expiration date, but it was either 2017 or 2018. Could you tell me if it was allowed to expire or if it was extended?" And I love that question because apparently the free trade agreement that's redoing NAFTA between the United States and Mexico and Canada, it's either done or close to done. And so this is such a timely question. Fast track did expire on July 1st, 2018. But remember how I told you that if Congress does nothing about it, then it just automatically gets renewed? Well, that's exactly what went down. Trump requested an extension and it was automatically approved because not a single person in Congress objected to Trump having fast track authority to basically move whatever deals he's making internationally faster through the Congress. And that pisses me off, honestly, that out of all these people on the Democratic side who are running for president, like none of them even think that it's worth a debate whether or not Trump should have fast track authority. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and listen to episode apparently 137 when I talked about this, because it's a big deal. You know, these are treaties and we're supposed to be very careful because international law trumps our domestic laws. Didn't intend that pun, but there it is. But yeah, international laws, they supersede our domestic laws. And this Congress is making it easier for Trump, of all people, and his people, to do treaties in our name. And so, yes, great question. Thank you, Mike, and thank you for contributing to the show. We also got a check for 12345 from George Meltzer. Hi, George, from South Lyon, Michigan. So thank you, George. We also got a $100 check from Justin Daniel in beautiful San Diego, California. I bet you're warm right now. Thank you, Justin. We also got $100 on the Cash App. $sign Congressional Dish from Jared Lord, who said, "For info, thank you." Well, you are very welcome. We got $25 on PayPal from Scott Olson. Thank you, Scott. We got $25 on PayPal from Lighthearted Works, with Works spelled WERKS. So if you want to check that out, Lighthearted Works. Thank you for contributing to the show. We got $20 on PayPal from Aaron Hahn. Thank you, Aaron. We got $20 on Venmo from Samuel Gelber, who said, canceling on Patreon, going to do this instead. You are a hero. Well, thank you very much. And I like the Venmos too. I don't think there's a middleman on that. Although Venmo is super confusing to me. Apparently they do have different accounts, so we might have to pay, I don't know. I need to look into it because they keep changing stuff. But as of right now, Venmo is a no middleman fees option. So Venmo's good too. We also got $20 on PayPal from Renita Leone. I know that name. And her message was, excellent episodes lately. I had not listened in a while due to time, personal changes. Glad to be back. Thank you. Glad to have you back. Thanks for contributing to the show. We also got $20 on PayPal from Lee Alberger, who said, keep spreading your message and don't get discouraged. I'm trying, man. I'm trying. But bills like HR1 really do help. So I'm excited to share the next episode with you. I know it's been, this Venezuela adventure has really been weighing on me. In fact, I just told my husband this morning that I barely slept last night. I just had all these regime changes in my head, and I had dreams that I was in Nicaragua with Mrs. Maisel. So, I mean, none of it made any sense, but just the fact that Nicaragua and Venezuela are in my dreams and keeping me awake, it's been dark. So yeah, I'm excited about HR1. This, I think you guys should be excited about too. There's good things in this bill, really good things in this bill. Back to the list, we also got $15 on Zelle from Teddy Light. And the message says, screw Elliott Abrams. Amen. And then the email says, hey, Jen, unfortunately, as a broke-ass college student, this is the first time I could send you money. But as a historian focused on Cold War-era Latin America, I just couldn't not send you something for highlighting the f***wad that is Elliott Abrams. Well, then you're gonna like this episode. My dad turned me on to your show a while back, and I've passed it on to everyone in my reach in turn. Thank you. I'm going back to my old way of marketing, which is that I'm done marketing. In fact, I've reached out to my virtual assistant. We're done with the social media posts. No one's sharing them. No one's liking them. I don't want to do them anymore. I think it's a waste of time and money. You know, I think the way this show is going to get bigger is because of people like Teddy who are sharing it with their friends. That's how the show grew in the first place. And we're going back to that because you're a better marketing department than me. I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. But back to the note, said, keep up the great work. You're truly inspiring human. I'll send you more money when it comes. Salute, Teddy Light. And he said, P.S. Cuba's been on that list as long as Castro has been in power, real or otherwise. Oh, I 100% know that. And they're being quite open about it. I'm worried about all three of the countries in the troika of tyranny, which is, obviously Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. So, yeah. There's a lot of countries on that list. And of course, we all know John Bolton wants to regime change Iran. I mean, that's the wet dream with that guy. So there's just, these people are so scary. They're so scary. But yeah, thank you, Teddy. We also got $15 on Zelle from Stacy Tibbetts. Thank you, Stacy. We got a $15 check from Jose Huerta of Caldwell, Idaho. It's Idaho. Caldwell, Idaho. And the note said, you do an amazing job. Stay awesome. Thank you. Well, thank you, Jose. Great to hear from you. We also got $13 on PayPal from Greg Hudson, who said, hey, Jen, I won some money betting on the Super Bowl. Go Pats! He didn't say that, but I sure did. But he said, so here's some money for all the good work you do, equal to the points they scored. Love it. Thank you, Greg. We also got $10 on Venmo from Mike Cretella, who said, listening to you tear apart and expose the U.S.-led coup in Venezuela is phenomenal, but it makes me feel helpless. I know the feeling, man. You mentioned calling, emailing our member of Congress, but maybe some of us haven't done so because we don't know how the process works or what to expect. Would you be able to run through, explain it like I'm 5 style, how and what to expect from contacting our representative? Oh, Mike, I'd love to. So basically, it's not scary at all. For your member of the House of Representative, you only have one. You go to house.gov. And up in the top right-hand corner, there's a spot where you can put in your zip code, and that will tell you who your representative is. And then that page should give you a bunch of phone numbers. Now, I like to call the Washington, D.C. office, but there will be local offices too. So if you want more bang from your phone call all of them. But you don't have to do that. And there's plenty of phone numbers for every single person that has representation in Congress, especially for senators. But yeah, you just go to house.gov, and same for the Senate. Senate.gov will give you their contact information if you just use those websites. And I like calling. It's more effective than emails. It's harder to ignore. So I really like calling, and I love it. Like, the person that's going to answer the phone is a staffer. This is not someone with any power. And so you just tell them what you're thinking. And I think it's really important to be polite, but it depends on what you're calling about. Like, if you're calling to ask them a question about your person's policy, that's one thing, but usually I'm just calling to make a comment. And what they do is that they write down the topic you called about and, were you for or against or whatever? And then you get added to a tally, and that's how they kind of judge where their constituents are on stuff. Usually my phone calls are no more than a minute. I try and keep it brief. And then sometimes when it comes to the staffer, I'll ask, like, do you know what I'm referring to? So if I was calling about Venezuela, I'd be like, okay, so are you aware of what's going on in Venezuela? Because sometimes they're not. Sometimes they're brand new, or, but you want to make sure that the person you're talking to is on the same page so that they can accurately give the message. But the key is just be nice. This is someone that's a staff. You're never going to get like Kamala Harris on the phone. And it's so easy. It's so easy, and it's so fast. You can make all 3 phone calls in under 5 minutes. And then for the ones that you don't get a staffer, you just leave a brief voicemail. If I was calling about Venezuela, I'd probably say, "Hi, Representative Lee. I'm a constituent in Alameda." And then I give my zip code. They always want the zip code for whatever reason. But yeah, give them your zip code and then say, "I just want to let you know that I don't support the efforts that the Trump administration or Congress is making towards overturning the government in Venezuela. I think we should allow Venezuela to determine their own future and stay out of it. Thank you for taking my call. Goodbye." The end. And that way, on the paper where it says got a call about Venezuela, it's another mark that says I care, and this is the side I'm on. So basically, you're calling just to be a check mark on that piece of paper. Yeah, super easy. So yeah, Mike, let me know how it goes for you. But calls are the best. But I mean, if you don't want to call, email, send snail mail, it doesn't matter. Just communicate with Congress, because right now there's not much pushback, especially on this Venezuela thing, but really on any topic, call every morning. It certainly can't hurt. Back to the list. We also got $10 on Venmo from Eric Callie Schuler, who said, "For the real news you provide." Well, I'm glad you liked it, and thank you for supporting it. We got $10. This was a check from Larry Tuck from Springfield, Missouri. Thank you, Larry. We got a $5 check from Tracy Marshu of Port St. Lucie, Florida. Thank you, Tracy. We got $5 on the Cash App. $sign Congressional Dish from Luciana, who said, "For awesome show." Thank you, darling. We got $5 on PayPal from Jose Garcia. Thank you, Jose. We got $5 on Venmo from Michelle Molina, who said, "Great podcast. Thank you very much." And that is it for the day. Except it's not, because we have one more note from a contributor. This is from Matt Payne, and he is contributing $5 an episode on Patreon, and he sent in a message. Oh, I remember this. So he said, "Matt Payne here again. Thanks for mentioning me on the podcast. I'm sorry I didn't give you more info about my podcast." Hey, don't be sorry. If you guys don't want the shout out on this show, like, that's 100% fine, but I'm just letting you know that I know people use my system where it's like, donate to Congressional Dish, and at the end, she'll say the name of your show. Like, I know you guys do that, and I'm okay with that. But Matt says, "First off, your podcast is content rich. I learn something every time, and it makes me laugh, smile, yell profanities, and grumble all in the same hour." Me too. My podcast is called F Stop, Collaborate, and Listen. I was hoping that was the name of your podcast. It's such a great name. In my podcast, I have conversations with fellow landscape photographers all over the world. In addition to fun photography chat, we actually talk about politics quite a bit, especially around issues of conservation. I'm trying to steer the photography community into caring more about our natural landscapes by encouraging folks to stop geotagging and to partner with public land trusts. Anyway, if you're interested, you can learn more here, and his website is www.mattpaynephotography.com. And of course, if anyone is looking for, and Matt, we will put that in, we have a page. What the hell do we call it? Oh, community suggestions. We'll put your website in the community suggestions. But back to the note he said, and of course, if anyone is looking for gorgeous artwork in their homes or offices, I take some pretty unique photographs from the tops of Colorado's highest mountains. Ooh, that sounds awesome. Keep up the great work. Maybe you can talk about the pros and cons of the recent land conservation bill that passed the Senate. I've linked it for you here. I don't have time to read a bill right now, but let me know if it passes the House too. If it becomes law, I'm more willing to dive in, but you have to keep in mind there are so many bills that are moved all the time. But if it passed the Senate, I mean, that's the tough one to get through. So I'd imagine it would pass the House. Just keep an eye on it for me and send me an email, and like, maybe I will. But right now, I can't read that right now. So I apologize. But yeah, Stop, Collaborate, and Listen is about beautiful photography and politics. So go ahead and check that out. Thanks, Matt. And I'd also like to thank Daryl, Karen, Mike, and Carrie at Pro Podcast Solutions, the best damn company for podcast editing, you guys. And I know that they can handle your business, which is why I'm telling you about it, because I'm pretty goddamn selfish, and I wouldn't tell you if I didn't think they could handle it. So Pro Podcast Solutions, love them, love them, love them. I'm also in love with Jess Hershey, jesshershey.com. Those are my virtual assistants, and I love everything they do. Also love Brian from Only Child Imaginations. He does all the artwork and operates the Congressional Dish store. God damn it, I keep forgetting to tell you guys about the store. But yeah, we have a Congressional Dish store, so buy some crap, and it helps me and Brian. And I'd like to thank my sister Lauren, who is the best accountant I could ask for. Yeah, it just keeps me in check. Love you. And then also, I love Joe and my dad. My dad did my financials for last year, and since it's all the way at the end of the episode, I guess I'll tell you guys that hung in here what happened. And last year we did okay. We're up about 6% from the year before if you take Amazon out, because I think you guys might remember that Amazon yanked my account last fall. That cost the podcast thousands of dollars. And so if you pretend that we never had Amazon to begin with and the podcast grew, if you don't, then we lost a little bit of money compared to last year. But we're basically holding steady, which I count as a victory at this point. Yeah, so that's where we're at. Next episode will be a Podfest. I'm hoping to see you guys there. And by the way, if you're going to Podfest, tweet me and I would love to meet you. But I'm actually quite approachable. I'm quite friendly. And my favorite drink is a Tito's and soda. So that's a good way to get my attention too. With a lime, not a lemon. All right, I'm going to go now. Thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore.